What's a devastating historical event that nobody talks about? The Carrington event. In 1859, solar flares hit the Earth, causing an aurora borealis effect to be seen all over the world. It lasted for several days, during which time it was reportedly bright enough to read by at midnight. Telegraph operators reported receiving shocks and burns from their devices, and in some cases removed the batteries powering the telegraphs as signals were being disrupted by the geomagnetic storm. After removing the batteries, the telegraphs still operated, in some cases better than they had when powered. It wasn't particularly devastating at the time, but it's estimated that if a similar storm were to hit us today, it would cripple the entire planet for potentially decades. The estimated repair cost in the US alone is measured in the trillions. In 2012, a similar storm missed the Earth by 9 days. I'm in college studying history. The year of living dangerously in Indonesia in 1965 through 66 saw absolute chaos and still has a marked effect on their society. It's possibly one of the largest mass killings of the last century, and I heard nothing about it ever living in the West. It's hard to say how many people actually died, but estimates range from 100,000 to 300,000, and even on up to 500,000 or 1 million dead. Basically, the Communist Party in Indonesia was heavily influenced by Maoism and ethnic Chinese civilians. It was the largest communist party outside of China. President Sukarno, who had helped the country through Japanese occupation and independence from the Dutch and British, had kept the house of cards balanced but was beginning to be swayed by communist policies. The military, staunchly anti-communist and largely supported by the US, would be looking to take power. Then, one night, 6 high-ranking members of the military were abducted and killed. The army spread the word that the communists were to blame and initiated mass reprisals. Killings, interrogations, and imprisonment ran rampant over the islands, and even ethnic Chinese or just suspected communists were taken. Despite working with Sukarno for many years, the US would support his liquidation and the rise of the military. It's unclear how extensive American support to the army was, but it's probable that they aided in training and might have even helped compile names of communists to the army. Eventually, a general by the name of Suharto would take power, and Sukarno would be placed under house arrest with no power. Today, the massacres and chaos aren't really taught in Indonesian schools, and it's clear that many have not come to terms with what happened. However, the mass killings of possibly 1 million or more people should rank up there in devastating events. Yeah, this is an event that I, a history major, have never even heard about, and it's called the Year of Living Dangerously? Why does it sound like some obnoxious rich kid's adventure OE and not like the absolute horror it must have been with that much death and terror on the streets for an entire year? The Victoria Hall disaster, all because kids were being kids in a death trap. The disaster started when about 1,000 children in the audience of a variety show were told they could get free toys. Kids began pouring down the aisles to get the toys, blocking the exits and piling on top of one another. Toys being given to the lower seats meant those in the balconies, unaccompanied by adults, thought they'd miss out, creating a rush to go down to get them. The exiting children turned a bend around which were double doors. One of these being locked created a bottleneck. Queen Victoria ended up giving money for the children's funerals. In the end, 183 of them were crushed to death. The locked door led to one boy who was there growing up and inventing the push-bar fire escape, a door that can be locked from one side but easily opened from the other. The Andijan massacre of 2005 in Uzbekistan. It's the largest mass shooting in Asia since Tiananmen Square, with over 1,000 killed and even more wounded. The Uzbek government forcefully silenced reform protests by firing into the crowd and then kicked out 90% of Westerners in the country when the US government and UN tried to investigate. Terrible loss of life that rarely gets remembered because the Uzbek government tried so hard to cover it up. The Goiânia accident in Brazil, where cesium-137 was handled by many people, including children. It's regarded as the worst radioactive incident to happen in Brazil. It was a radioactive contamination accident that happened on September 13, 1987, after a radiotherapy machine from an abandoned hospital was illegally stripped for parts, and said parts were stolen. On September 16th, one of the thieves opened a cesium capsule, then on September 18th sold it to a scrapyard. The same night, the owner of the scrapyard saw a blue glow in the machine's parts, which ended up being the opened capsule. Thinking it might be valuable, he brought it to his home. Over the next 3 days, he invited friends and family to see the strange glowing substance. On September 21st, one of his friends succeeded in freeing several rice-sized grains of the glowing material from the opened capsule. He then started sharing some of them with friends and family. On September 25th, the capsule was again sold to another scrapyard, although one day before the sale, more dust was removed from the capsule by the scrapyard's owner's brother. The brother then took the dust home and spread it on the concrete floor, where later his daughter would play in it with the dust. She also ate while sitting on the floor, and dust particles fell on her food, contaminating it. One of the family members of the owner of the first scrapyard noticed that many people around her fell ill, and on September 28th, she reclaimed the capsule from the second scrapyard and brought it to the hospital. In the morning of September 29th, it was confirmed that the material was radioactive, and the doctors persuaded authorities to take immediate action on the matter. The city, state, and national governments were all aware of the incident by the end of the day. News of the radiation incident was broadcast on local, national, and international media. Within days, nearly 130,000 people went to local hospitals concerned they might have been exposed. Of these, only 250 were indeed contaminated, some with radioactive residue still on their skin. 4 of these people died. I feel the need to mention the Bronze Age collapse. It's not as though nobody talks about it at all, but considering how catastrophic it was, it doesn't get nearly enough attention. At this time, civilizations were still pretty scarce, but the Eastern Mediterranean was full of them. We can't pinpoint an exact reason, but at some point, it all just fell apart. The Mycenaeans? Gone. The Hittites? Gone. The Minoans? Gone. And the Egyptians? Barely clinging on and having serious problems. There are many things that happened around that time in that general area that could be the culprit. Volcanoes, earthquakes, drought, famine, war, and of course the oft-cited invasions from foreigners that came by boat that historians have named the Sea People, because we have basically no idea where they came from. In reality, it was probably a combination of some of, or even all of them. Taiping Heavenly Kingdom of Hong Xiuquan. Put simply, it was an upstart kingdom in 1850s China that directly and indirectly led to the deaths of millions, maybe 10 million people, through massacre and famine. Hong Xiuquan believed he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ and persuaded enough people to follow along and start a civil war. Check out God's Chinese Son by Jonathan Spence for more information. Baghdad used to be one of the biggest and most vibrant cities in the world until the 1200s, until the Mongols came. Baghdad didn't recover its year 1200 population until the 1980s. The Second Congo War. It's the deadliest conflict since World War II, with about 5.4 million deaths, a vast majority of them due to malnutrition and disease. A lot of African history is overlooked, so here's a few more 20th century African conflicts to look into if you're interested. The Boer Wars, Mau Mau Uprising, Rhodesian Bush War, First and Second Liberian Civil Wars, Sierra Leone Civil War, the Angolan Civil War, First and Second Sudanese Civil Wars, Somali Civil War, Eritrean-Ethiopian War, Congo Crisis, Nigerian Civil War. Yep, all of these had massive casualties proportionate to their population, most of them civilian, and we're basically ignorant about all of them. That's our Euro and US-centric history books for you, folks. I'm always amazed that people know so little about Pol Pot in Cambodia. His regime killed 25% of its population. Let that sink in. 1 in 4. If you were educated, you were one of the first killed. The extent of what happened in Cambodia is really hard to fathom. I spent 2 months traveling around Southeast Asia a few years back, and one of the days that will always be fresh in my memory was the Somba trip to the killing fields outside of Siem Reap. Our driver, Mr. Sony, was touring us around to various historical sites, the S21 Museum as well, and would never step foot into any of them. I remember asking him if he'd ever been to any of these sites, and he said, "I don't go in because my entire family is in there." Absolutely heartbreaking. A huge portion of an entire generation just wiped out. During World War II, the Japanese had invaded the Alaskan island of Attu. On the island was the village of Attu, where the Aleutian tribe had lived for centuries. The only non-natives were the wife, schoolteacher, and priest husband, who were elderly and beloved by the townspeople. The husband was shot in front of his wife by the Japanese. After that, the Japanese loaded the native population onto ships back to Japan, where they worked in prisoner of war camps, where many died from disease and execution. The Japanese saw them as lower than soldier prisoners of war and almost subhuman, because they didn't fight back and thus treated them horribly. When the war ended, only a handful of the native population survived, and they went back home only to find their village burnt down. They left the island and it now remains uninhabited basically, driving the Attu tribe to extinction. Years later, the Japanese left a peace monument on the island in honor of the American and Japanese soldiers that died there, but have yet to apologize to the descendants of the Attu tribe they destroyed. The Johnstown flood of 1889, the deadliest civil engineering disaster on US soil. It killed 2,209 people. After a dam collapsed, it swept up rail cars, passengers, trees, an entire town of 10,000, and then swirled it around and ejected the debris downriver into a bridge where it all caught fire. Destruction was beyond belief, and all because some rich steel magnates up the mountain didn't maintain the dam they used to keep their fishing reservoir. It's actually worse than that. The rich wanted to take their carriages across the dam, but the top of the dam was too narrow for their carriages. So, to save some money, they lowered the structure, which made it wider but also destabilized the building. They were warned about this, but because they're rich jerks, they didn't care. So it wasn't just that they didn't maintain the dam, it was them actively effing it up. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below. And if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. The year 536 marked the beginning of a very bad time period. Basically, several natural disasters and social upheaval abso-frickin-lutely devastated multiple societies. It's thought that a volcanic eruption blocked out enough sun to cause crop failures across Europe and as far as China. While this was happening, terrible plagues were also affecting the Middle East. Economies everywhere felt a ruin and stagnation in the years that followed because several other eruptions later made things worse. The Mayans' society and the lost scriptures that we still haven't found, on top of the scriptures we still can't seem to decipher. One thing that doesn't get talked about was more of a phenomenon or major problem than an event, and that was how many people died in theater fires due to poor design, combustible materials, few fire exits, and panic. One of the worst was the Iroquois Theater in Chicago, which is both the deadliest theater fire and the deadliest single building fire in US history, where patrons died after sparks from an arc light set a curtain on fire, then a chain reaction started, exacerbated by failures of the things in a place that were supposed to combat fire. The theater had been overbooked to compensate for earlier poor sales, causing some to sit blocking the exits. The fire was immediately worsened when performers opened the stage door to get outside, as it turned the fire into a fireball. Many people were held inside by iron gates that had been put in place to prevent people from sneaking in without paying. As people fled, they tumbled downstairs, trampled each other, and got squashed to death. Their unfamiliarity with the building got them stuck in dead ends and up against windows. Many jumped from fire escapes and died, while those behind them were saved, the bodies of the earlier jumpers cushioning their falls. All in all, 602 people died, many of whom were children. The story is a lot more complicated and sordid with city corruption and stuff. The one takeaway is the incident promoted the development and use of the panic bar. I was fascinated with the story of the Osage Indians in the United States. The book Killers of the Flower Moon is an excellent book detailing basically what happened. They got sent to Oklahoma and found huge oil reserves on their land. They were rich and hired white people as servants, which didn't go over well. People tried to marry in to get part of the riches. There were tons of murders, and the investigation led to the creation of the FBI in the United States. And the book about this tragedy has been adapted into a fairly well-received movie, if any of you want to know more. It's such a remarkably recent historical event, too. The New London School Explosion. On the afternoon of March 18, 1937, the shop teacher at the school in New London, Texas, turned on an electric sander. Unbeknownst to him, there was a massive natural gas leak under the school. The sander sparked, which ignited the gas and caused a massive explosion that killed almost 300 students and teachers. It was absolutely horrific. The force of the explosion was so great that a 2-ton block of concrete crushed a car parked 200 feet away. This event is actually why natural gas has a smell now. They started adding it after the explosion so that something like this couldn't happen again so easily. My grandfather was actually one of the survivors of the explosion. He never talked about it, even to his own family, so I didn't really know too much about it other than the fact that he had survived it, until after his death. Towards the end of his life, he'd suffered a series of strokes that left him pretty physically incapacitated. So my dad had given him a voice-activated tape recorder and suggested maybe he could record his memoirs for his grandkids to listen to someday. As it turns out, he did. We have hours and hours of cassette tapes of him telling the story of his actually pretty interesting life, including a big section on the New London school explosion. For the sake of everyone's privacy, I'll call my grandfather Papa and use an initial for anyone else. He was in the 8th grade when it happened, in his English class at about 3 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon. At the beginning of class, Papa and his buddy T had been messing around and being loud in the back of the classroom, as 8th grade boys often do. His teacher, Miss M, had had enough of their disruptions and made Papa switch seats with another student. He moved to the girl's desk in the front row and she moved into his desk in the back of the room. When the school exploded, they were taking a test on the book Ivanhoe. Papa was knocked about for a short time, and when he woke up, he couldn't see anything because the dust was so thick. He looked down and saw that his pencil had blown clear through his hand. He saw that the whole back of the room was gone. I won't go into details, but there were bodies, and parts of bodies, everywhere. The students in the front half of the room survived. The students in the back half did not. That included Papa's friend T and the little girl who'd been forced to take Papa's desk because of his misbehavior at the beginning of class. If he hadn't been acting up, he would have been killed and she would have lived. He carried the guilt of her death until the day he died. Papa's classroom was on the 2nd floor. There wasn't any way to get to the room other than the open cavity of the explosion. After the few seconds of initial shock wore off, he and another classmate jumped into action. They were the only 2 kids in the classroom who hadn't been badly injured. They made a tourniquet out of a sock and shoelace for a girl with a severe injury to her arm and dug out their teacher, who was alive but badly injured. By then, men were running in underneath the hole, so Papa and the other boy started lowering the badly injured to them. Then those who could walk, including Papa, climbed down. He ran off to look for his older brother B to see if he was okay. As it turned out, B had been supposed to be in geometry class. However, he and his buddy had snuck out to go fishing. The explosion happened as they were heading to the door to head out to the parking lot. The force of the blast sent them tumbling head over foot across the lot. They were both banged up and dazed, but they survived. The rest of their geometry class was killed. I don't know that there's a moral in the fact that both my grandfather and his brother survived because they were misbehaving that day. I do know that it weighed very heavily on both of them for the rest of their lives. There's a lot more to the story about the day and the aftermath, most of it absolutely horrific, but I won't go into all of it here. A few small tidbits though. Papa and the boy who helped him rescue the other students from their classroom were both awarded medals and certificates of valor for their actions that day. Nearly every family in town lost a child. Some of them lost all their children. I'm sure you can imagine the extreme toll this took on everyone's mental health. Papa described New London in the months following the explosion as a town with no children. To help with the healing process, the oil companies actively recruited families with kids to transfer in, so that there was a sense of normalcy when school started again in the fall. And Papa had played the French horn in the school band. However, when the school started up again, he was asked to switch to trumpet as the entire trumpet section had been lost. He went on to fight in World War II, and he saw some of the worst conflict in the Pacific, including Peleliu and the liberation of Manila, but he said that nothing he saw was ever as bad as what he saw on the day of the explosion. I'm always amazed that more people didn't know about it. It was major international news at the time. Galveston, Texas was once considered to be one of the most important commercial ports in the United States, and was referred to by several fantastical names such as Queen City of the Gulf and the Wall Street of the West. All of that changed when it suffered a near-direct hit from a devastating Category 4 hurricane in 1900, the deadliest natural disaster in American history. Pretty much the entire city was destroyed by a storm surge, and anywhere from 8,000 to 12,000 people were killed. Galveston was rebuilt but never truly regained its status. Houston became the state's commercial center in the storm's wake, in addition to other factors. The Bronze Age collapse. Arguably more devastating than the fall of the Western Roman Empire. So much knowledge lost. Truly one of history's great mysteries. I recommend reading up on it, it's really interesting. Until I learned about it, I had no idea that there were once whole other Dark Ages that happened before what we normally think of the Dark Ages, although that term is a misnomer. The Bronze Age collapse ushered in a centuries-long Dark Age that lasted until classical Greece. The Taiping Rebellion. Around the same time as the American Civil War, a massive civil war raged in China. The rebellion was led by Hong Xiuquan, who proclaimed himself to be the brother of Jesus Christ. Estimated 20 to 30 million dead. For reference, 1 million died in the American Civil War. Again, the scale of these events compared to their contemporary European or American ones is always absolutely mind-boggling. The Rwandan atrocities have got to be one of these events. I watched Shake Hands with the Devil here a while ago, and I highly recommend it. Unspeakable acts of brutality inflicted. It still gives me chills. In 535, humans went through hell. Many reported a strange color in the skies, not just in Europe. A dense, dry fog was also reported in Asia and the Middle East. Even the regions now known as the Americas weren't spared. There was drought in Peru, temperatures were rather low in some places, it snowed even in the summertime. One survivor, a Roman politician named Cassiodorus, explained about the bluish sun and no shadows being cast even in the noon. It's been hypothesized that Iceland holds the reason for the events between the years 535 and 536. Iceland is best known for its volcanoes, and it was possible one such was to blame. Leprosy colonies of Hawaii. People who were diagnosed with leprosy were forcibly banished to Kalaupapa to live out the rest of their lives. They were dug graves and had to stand in them while their families and friends basically had a living funeral for them, where they had dirt thrown on them and were pronounced dead to the world and no longer part of the community. This continued through 1969, even after Hawaii officially became a state. The Highland Clearances. Over a period of about 150 years between the 18th and 19th centuries, English and lowland Scottish landlords evicted thousands upon thousands of Highland Scots from their ancestral homelands and replaced them with sheep. It's hard to classify as a historical event because it went on for so long, and it's usually interpreted as an ambiguous series of largely isolated incidents. There were attacks on villages in which landlords would burn their tenants' houses to the ground to get them to leave, and burned their land so that nothing would grow. Multiple people were caught in the fires and died. During the Glencoe massacre, 30 members of Clan MacDonald were murdered by Scottish government forces for supporting the Jacobite uprising. The Irish potato famine also affected the Highland Scots, who grew potatoes, and many people were starved or were forced to leave as well. As a result, there was a series of mass migrations in which Scots travelled to Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the US, and largely lost their language and culture. It's very sad, and all that's basically why Highland culture and language has largely been lost. The disease outbreaks that hit the Americas with the arrival of the Europeans. You hear about a 90% death rate, and it sounds made up, but whatever the actual number was, entire civilizations were literally wiped out. Cultures that had existed for thousands of years are just gone, with barely a record left. You have stories of people coming across whole villages of corpses. These people died never having even seen the Europeans, never knowing what was killing them and their loved ones, and were totally hopeless to do anything about it. China during World War II. The Japanese absolutely decimated the areas they occupied during the war, not just through weapon-based exterminations, but through biological warfare that resulted in the slow deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, largely forgotten by history. I'm not in any way a supporter of the current Chinese government, but I feel like where they're at is a response not only to the communist government tyranny of the Mao era, but to the horrific Japanese atrocities that allowed it to happen in the first place. The assassination of James Garfield. He was a known advocate for racial equality. He appointed black men into his cabinet and tried expanding public education into the South to get more African Americans an education. He tried to fight for racial equality but died 4 months into his presidency, which messed it up. The blinding of 15,000 soldiers. The Bulgarians and Byzantines would clash every couple of years, and after one battle, the Byzantine leader just snapped and cut out the eyes of the soldiers that surrendered, then sent them back home. The Bulgarian leader died upon hearing the news. Who is your contender for worst teacher of the decade? The biochemistry department at my college has notoriously bad professors. I had one who in the past years made a mistake grading an exam, giving some people points for wrong answers and marking down correct answers, but they refused to regrade them. She was the stereotypical, bitter, "my class is hard and some of you will fail" professor who still thinks that suffering is a rite of passage in the sciences. She wouldn't upload slides even when students were snowed in at home and the lecture recording malfunctioned. A lot of university professors don't care about their students, but this one truly made me feel like she wanted us to fail. By the second week of class, I cried in lecture and went straight to my advisor afterwards to switch from a Bachelor of Science to a Bachelor of Arts just to get out of her class. Third grade teacher. She had her teacher's pet that could do no wrong. One day, her pet got a low score on her test and began crying. To make her feel better, she points to the worst student in the class that probably had an undiagnosed learning disability and says in front of the whole class, "Don't worry, you could be like her and have an F carved into your report card." In 5th grade, she yelled at me for using a mechanical pencil instead of wood on a page she would never read. Oh, Mrs. Davis in 1st grade. One time I had a messy desk. You remember those ones with the top that flipped up so you could store your books and stuff inside. She picked up the desk and literally dumped all of my books and school supplies onto me and made me clean it up off the floor while the rest of the class watched. Of course, I started crying. What kind of sadist does that to a frickin' 6-year-old? Well, funnily enough, my school history teacher was weird. She'd always give us strange assignments and tell weird stories about her personal life. But today I learned that she shoved a knife into the stomach of her husband about a week ago. He's alive? When I say funnily enough, the funny thing is that I found this question the same day I heard the news. The stabbing part isn't funny at all. A college business statistics professor who only talked about how rich he was from learning statistics and how he had a Porsche with a radar detector in the front and back. I failed that class. The next professor was so much better and I actually learned from her and passed. We had a professor who was similar. He'd always talk about how successful he was. Once he claimed that instead of sending a CV for a job application, he just sent a picture and got the job because he thought outside the box. I had a similar professor too. He'd always talk about how many Fortune 500 companies he'd worked at in the past 10 years. All I could think was, man, this guy cannot keep down a job. I do think it's unfair when other professionals accuse teachers or lecturers of being people who couldn't make it in their desired field. Loads of teachers just genuinely thrive in academia and enjoy educating. But I'll reluctantly admit that they may have a point in one or two cases like the above one. Imagine blowing through all of those jobs and then just getting a job where you waste everyone's time bragging about your, quote, achievements. In 6th grade, I was sick and missed a day of school, so I didn't know what the homework was. The next day in class, the first thing I did was ask one of my classmates for the previous night's homework so I could do it that night. My teacher gave me a 0 and a detention in front of everyone for not turning in the assignment. I went to her privately after class and explained that I didn't have any friends in the class and had gotten everything I needed to do it that night as soon as I walked in before class started. She told me it's not her problem if I'm a loser and that I should have found a way instead of making excuses. I was a great student with straight A's, never missed school and was always well-mannered. I was absolutely mortified and so deeply hurt because in reality, not only did I not have any friends in that class, I didn't have many friends at all. The friends I did have, which were more school friends than actual friends, were on another team, so had a different set of teachers. Later in the quarter, I turned in a poem that I was incredibly proud of. I got nice paper to print it on and everything, and the poem itself was very real and raw. She failed me on the project, and when I approached her about why she failed me, she told me the whole thing was stupid, the visual presentation and the poem itself. My mum still has that project framed in her house and reminds me from time to time how meaningful it was for an 11-year-old to have written it. I'm not sure what that teacher had against me and still haven't been able to make sense of it all these years later, but I've never forgotten how she treated me. Grade 10 English teacher. Had an assignment where we made up fake names and did a pen pal to other students in the class. He also joined the assignment and wrote very inappropriate letters to one of the female students. She loved the boys, but always hated on and picked on the girls. Just as an example, I worked really hard on a project for her class. It came back with a D- on it. My mum had had enough of her crap and took my project to the principal. She asked him to tell her what grade he'd give on the project. He looked it over and read through everything and said it was definitely A work. Mum showed him the grade she had given me on it. The teacher was spoken to and my grade changed. She also failed me in that class along with several other females, claiming I'd never turned in any homework. I had, but couldn't prove it. The boys in her class never received less than a B. The year after I had her, she retired after speaking with the principal and the school board again. By the way, I was a straight A student except in this one class. In middle school jazz band, the teacher asked me to play a solo during one of our performances. After the performance, the teacher congratulated us and told the soloists what a great job they did. Except for me. For me, I was told how horrible I sounded in front of the group. Never performed a solo again. 3rd grade teacher pinned me against a blackboard. I remember looking out to my classmates and seeing the look of horror on their faces as I gasped for air. This was in '79. Then later, a girl he was writing to eventually came to her parents about it. She literally shoved a ball of duct tape in my mouth in front of the whole class because I couldn't hold in my laughter after my friend said something really funny. Mrs. Huddleston, grade 4. I had a troubled childhood, and I remember during that grade that I'd found out that my grandfather was divorcing my grandmother, and that he'd kicked her onto the ground and stepped on her while threatening her with an axe. So, naturally, I probably had some issues, but I never acted out like a jerk kid or anything. Anyway, this teacher was trying to teach me something after class, something with blocks and multiplication maybe. And I remember she was getting angry and frustrated, so I was crying because my home life had a lot of anger and fighting. She eventually slammed the blocks on the desk in anger and started screaming at me while other kids laughed. Now she wins awards for all of her good work. She might have just had an off day, but that school memory sticks out with me more than any others during that time, and I'll never associate her with anything else. That was 1994 or something like that. Screw her, man. A teacher who wanted students to learn programming, and the method of testing was filling the blank. No wonder most of them wanted me to tutor them. My math teacher was a terrible person. She once wanted to call my mum because I wasn't doing it how she wanted, and she got mad at me because I didn't know the mobile number of my mother. I think it was in 7th grade or so. She also told me in front of the whole class that I'm not the brightest bulb. I had a professor who was awful at teaching. I never liked him. He eventually got fired after an investigation into him, sparked by PETA, we were told, and found out that he was doing unethical testing on puppies and falsifying data for academic studies before coming to our college. I forget his name, but he taught genetics. Mine asked me, "Did your father ever teach you how to act?" I informed him that my father had died 4 years earlier. 2 weeks later, my stepdad came to pick me up for an appointment, saying he's there to pick up his kid. The teacher over the phone with the office says, "You mean the deceased father is here for pickup?" All through high school, that teacher just kept doubling down, never showed remorse for what he had said. He'd chase me into other classrooms because I had a hat on and I needed to take it off. This gave me motivation to become the compassionate, empathetic, and awesome teacher that I am today. My kids always get the benefit of the doubt, and I respect them. I had a college professor who favored the boys blatantly. When a girl asked a question, she'd always belittle us or ask the questioner why they hadn't read the assignment. If a boy student asked the same question, suddenly it was, "Oh, good question. Let's explore that." She couldn't explain concepts well at all. We destroyed her on the end of course review after finding out she was seeking tenure. Seeking tenure pro tip: don't alienate 50% of the student body like an idiot. Solid career advice for any aspiring educators out there. If all the people you find yourself criticizing heaviest are of a particular gender, race, or genetic factor, maybe you're a jerk and you're digging yourself into a real deep hole that you deserve not to climb out of. A math teacher in grade 9. His name was Mr. Tingley. Not even kidding. The entire class, other than me, failed grade 9 math. None of us ever understood what he was saying. As an adult now, I think he had dementia. I got 93% in math despite not knowing what the frick was happening ever in that class. When I was doing placement forms for high school, they tried to put me in academic challenge math. I said, "No way, just please let me do normal math." When I had my first test in grade 10, I got 34%. There was an emergency meeting with the teacher and the principal where they interrogated me for being on substances. Nope, no substances. For some unfathomable reason, the Tingler, which is what we called him, liked me and gave me that ludicrous mark in his class. The grade 10 teacher suggested moving me to remedial math. I said no. I asked her to teach me grade 9 and grade 10 in the same year. She said that would require 3 hours of homework per day just for the grade 9 math. I said fine. I wound up with 5 hours of math homework per night. I literally spent a year doing homework until 1 a.m. and getting only 4.5 hours sleep per night to catch up. Ugh. Finished out the year with 85% in Math 10, the normal matriculation math. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below. And if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. We had a weird, creepy teacher for my 6th grade language arts class who was mentally insane. Mr. S immediately established himself as the de facto cool teacher of the school. In fact, as a teacher, he was quite generous to all the boys in the class who went along with his antics. I was not one of those. We had several books we had to read, and as the year progressed, we were woefully behind on every single one of them, meaning that we were going to be unprepared for the standardized tests the district did at the end of the year, and rumors abounded that if we got low scores, we had to take remedial classes. I protested and nobody cared. I started to suspect that he was messed up in the head when he started making off comments to other male students, and when he started to refer to the narrator of an audiobook we were listening to as his best friend. I read a lot and listened to many audiobook tapes, and I knew that the man was a renowned and respected voiceover artist, so I started having my doubts about Mr. S. One day in November, I came in on a Monday morning and the principal was in the class, and we were advised that Mr. S had gotten into trouble, had been fired, and would not be returning. The teachers refused to tell us anything more. Rumors swirled, but then died away. Luckily for me, my mother was in the school district. One day in 9th grade, I attended a social function and I asked a teacher about Mr. S. Apparently, he had been grooming some kids he liked and invited them over, where he gave them booze and put on some adult films. Thank God when he tried to go further, everybody freaked out and scrammed. He was promptly arrested the next day on his way into work. They found all sorts of unsavory stuff at his place. Oh, the agony of choice. Either the high school math teacher who pushed her students so hard and gave a punishing amount of homework and did very little teaching. She drove one of her students into a pretty dark place because she put so much pressure on his life, and he disappeared after a while. She shrugged it off and continues in her position to this day. Or the community college teacher who locked the doors so students couldn't get in or out of her classroom. A student told her that's illegal and at the very least she's breaking the fire code. She said, "If you have a complaint, go to the office and file one. If enough students complain, a committee might look at it. If they do, a ruling is still months away, and as a tenured professor and personally friends with many people on that committee, I can tell you nothing will come of it. All she did is try and sell us some self-published books that she wrote. And yes, she changed the date and time of the final 4 times. Mrs. Livesey. Her name spelled backwards is Yes Evil. He repeatedly tried to get female students' phone numbers and kept a poster of Britney Spears in his room. He was incredibly creepy. I was a nerdy student who was known to be liked by all teachers and students. This one art teacher decided she didn't like me and kept telling me that my artwork was basically crap and I should redo it, and at the end of the year gave me a 4, which is the equivalent to a D. I was the only kid who got that grade. Even the kids who didn't turn in their work got C's or 3s. When a student came back from heart surgery, our teacher straight up didn't believe them. She humiliated me in front of all my classmates by pointing straight at me and saying I did bad on an exam. I was 9 years old, kinda why I have anxiety from school to this day. For grade school, my grade 5 teacher. Every little thing I did, she'd call me out and get me in trouble no matter what. Before and after that year, I never got in trouble. She never helped me no matter what as well. Even though it was my first year out of special ed and I needed the extra help in the transition. Oh, and worst thing she ever did to me? When I was in her class, I fell off the monkey bars and hurt my back real bad. I was screaming in pain and could barely walk. When I was walking to the office with the playground supervisor, she saw us and told me that I was fine and I should be in class, even though she had sent me home for smaller medical things before. The playground supervisor told her off and went to the office, explained everything and phoned my mum to take me to the hospital to get checked out. Let's just say my mum was really happy that this teacher retired before my brother had her. She was happy that she had never had to deal with her again either. And for university, my sports economics professor. He only tested on the sample questions we had, but never went through how to do them in class. All he did was go over the background of the topic. We had a teacher that was a neo-Third Reich enthusiast. I'm dead serious. My kindergarten teacher 35 years ago. Here's a few things I remember. Called me out in front of class for coloring a banana poorly. I'm severely nearsighted. This happened approximately 6 months before my first pair of glasses. We had a nap rest time. The other class got to lay down on floor mats. We had to rest our head while sitting at a desk. No problem. However, she'd yell at anyone whose eyes were open. If you didn't have your eyes closed, you'd better not face her desk. SWATs were a thing back then for pretty mild behavior and or not getting homework done. Forced everyone to take a tree's worth of worksheets on the last day of school to practice over the summer. They were just extra copies of what we'd already done, and everyone talked about how we were just going to throw them out as soon as we got home. Well, I'll say one thing for this teacher, and that's although it seems like she was, as you say, absolutely terrible, that the fact that all of this was acceptable might have been more of a product of the time than anything else. Even though there are still shocking teachers today, I'd be surprised if anyone could get away with laying a hand on a kid like she did. My junior kindergarten teacher was definitely a racist. I started school in 2002, so September 11th was still pretty fresh in our minds. Most of the students were non-white and immigrants or the kids of immigrants, and most were Muslim. My junior kindergarten teacher happened to dislike those groups, so she took it out on her 4-year-old students. She did crap like changing our ethnic names to something more Anglo. My easy-to-spell, easy-to-pronounce 3-letter Hebrew name was changed to Aaron, for example. And she only called on white, non-immigrant Christian kids and made fun of kids who kept halal or kosher, yelled at me because I couldn't come to school on Yom Kippur, and talked smack about the hijabi mums to the few white, Christian, non-immigrant parents. Oh, not a teacher, but a guidance counselor I had when I was in my final year of school. They told me I would end up dead in a gutter in 20 years if I didn't go to university. My 3rd grade teacher bopped us in the head with a plastic wiffle bat when he didn't like our attitude or answers. Had to stop when he made a girl's head bleed. He hit her barrettes. For me, my grade 2 to 4 teacher. For some strange reason, the school kept her with us for 3 straight years. She was not a nice teacher and always had a frown on. The worst thing she ever did was the school had some kind of bike competition that we could sign up for. Nobody in my class signed up for it, so she kept us in the class away from the event. We could see the whole school watching the event through the window, and we were pretty mad. Had a teacher who would give me detention every week. Reasons included talking during a group project, not bringing pencils, having long hair, and calling him a B-word that rhymes with snitch. I had a Spanish teacher who got a job at another high school and decided to not give a darn for the last 5 months of class. He'd sit at his desk and watch The Walking Dead. Sometimes he'd say something like, "Okay, class, today, think about Spanish." He then gave us a challenging final exam over material he'd never taught us. My 11th grade history teacher said in front of the whole class that I didn't have the looks to be a meteorologist, which was my dream since I was 5. The class itself was a waste of time since nothing was actually graded, so no one even tried. And this was supposed to be an IBHL class, which is no joke. Since then, I graduated from the #1 meteorology program in the US and glowed up big time. Went from over 190 pounds in high school to 155, while he was fired for inappropriate conduct with kids. Needless to say, Mr. S can go F himself. Not the worst one, but weird. I went to a Christian school, so we had a religion teacher. It's like theology class, but it's just odd because Mrs. P will always spend the whole session talking about her life experiences. One time she talked about losing her V-plates, she had just got married, and how she bled and passed out on the bed after their first time, with full details and everything. I think everyone in class was horrified. Also, please note that life skills were taught much later due to our school being Christian. It was a hardcore school. An English teacher who basically just played songs in English to class and kept using her cell phone in a public school. It's not that she was a bad teacher, but just that she didn't know how to teach a fricking class. This was math. This was my junior year of high school. Very early in the year, all she'd do was give us worksheets, not really explain anything and just sit behind her desk. And I know students could go to her desk and ask for help, but in the same sense, you as the teacher should walk around and check on students to see if they need any help. And she just didn't do that. Literally all students in that class were talking about going to a different math class after the trimester was over. One day, she confronted us all and asked why we wanted to go to another math teacher's class. Where I'm going with this is that we basically had a long discussion on why we thought she was crap at teaching and what she could do better. She took our advice and started doing what we suggested. She's basically doing better than what she was at the beginning of the year. She's still not the best, but considering how she's teaching these days, it's a huge improvement. The last thing she did of this kind was not that long ago. She gave us 3 worksheets about baseball. We had to find the height of the home run walls, how fast the ball was going after being hit and stuff like that, and we as the class would have asked her, but she said we couldn't ask any questions and we needed to figure it out ourselves. I literally went to my sophomore math teacher for help. He helped me with the first page and said the other 2 were impossible to figure out using math and that we needed to use physics. All the kids were struggling and basically did nothing as we didn't get taught this. We were just shown a video. Like I said, not the best and not the worst. She has her ups and downs, but as of late, she's been doing decently. In middle school, I was partially hospitalized due to some issues I had over the summer. When I went back to school, it was only for half days. I was in advanced classes and most of my teachers chipped in to help since I wasn't completely going to class. The one exception was my advanced math teacher that refused to help me and told me if I wanted to pass, I shouldn't have gotten hospitalized. Middle school was not a fun time for me. How was your boring meeting interrupted in a completely unexpected way? We were in our weekly meeting and heard a huge boom, similar to thunder but louder and longer. Everyone ran to the window, and the car detailing shop next to us was in flames and pieces of the building were strewn about everywhere. They evacuated our building and I got the afternoon off, and miraculously, no one had died. We were having a meeting about a piece of process equipment and how we should replace it soon before it fails. Around that moment, an engineer walked in and announced that the piece of equipment in question had just failed. I caused the interruption. My dad used to be a pastor at a church when I was much younger. One night they were having a meeting about how it was important for the church to have liability insurance, particularly if someone were to get hurt on the church's property. My older brother and I were playing in the children's area with my mum when this was happening. Somehow I ended up falling onto a doorframe and splitting my forehead open. My mother runs into the meeting with me while I had blood all over my face. All the elders and my dad start freaking out and we ended up going to the hospital. The church brought insurance the next day. In short, I became an object lesson on why insurance is important. We were having an all-hands meeting a couple of years ago and several people, as always, had dialed in on the phone. They ask everyone to mute themselves, of course, but someone always forgets. In the middle of our director addressing all of us, we suddenly heard a car horn on the phone, followed by, "Stay in your fricking lane." The director just stopped, laughed, and then said, "As a reminder, it's strictly against policy for any employee to use their phone while driving a car." One of the engineers was napping in the closet in the conference room and walked out of the closet mid-meeting. We were all pretty surprised. I hope that the individual in question followed the rules of comedy, straightened his tie, nodded seriously in greeting, and walked out without explaining himself further. Years ago, I was in a conference call with all of our branch offices. Maybe 14 people in the room and another dozen or so on the call. The co-owner was giving some talk, and right as he pauses, we hear over the conference speaker, "Jesus, this frickin' meeting is bullcrap." The co-owner is a very imposing gentleman, and you could tell his blood was boiling. "Who the frick said that?" he screams. There's a dead silence in the room. "Who the frick said that?" he repeats. Again, dead silence in the room and on the conference call. He eventually calmed down, even though no one admitted to the gaffe. We think one of our technicians simply forgot to mute his mic, but we were never able to figure out who it was. For the record, the meeting was actually fricking bullcrap. We were in the middle of a presentation to an important client, and my coworker, who was doing most of the talking, had a pen burst in his front shirt pocket. Now, this wasn't a huge leak, but it was a light-colored shirt and everyone noticed, so he excused himself to take care of it. Anyway, we carried on in his absence and he came back not more than 5 minutes later and sat down. I turned to look at him and the small blob of ink had since been replaced by a huge, washed-out stain covering about half of his chest. It was impossible not to notice, but we all did our best to keep it together and not laugh. That is, until someone says, "We can kinda see your nips in there, man." It was a government video conference call meeting. Coffee, tea, and snacks had been provided on a small table. A lady got up to get something and started screaming that the cup was filled with hundreds of baby spiders. A woman in tactical purchasing answered her phone, which was on full volume, mid-meeting with 2 vice presidents, 3 facility managers, and 3 department heads present. She didn't leave the room and proceeded to discuss her child's mental health issues and current prescriptions for like 15 minutes. No one had the heart to interrupt her, so we just sort of postponed the meeting until she finally hung up. Half the room had left by that point, extremely frickin' awkward. In a corporate training, and my assistant manager let out a huge as he fell backwards in his chair and crashed through a closet door. He had fallen asleep. Healthy-looking middle-aged lady died mid-meeting. Just slumped over, supposedly caused by a brain aneurysm. Really drives home the pointlessness of it all. Once I was walking down the hallway, tossing raisins into my mouth for a quick snack, and one bounced off my lip, across the floor and into an office where people were having a meeting. I knew they saw it bounce through the door because it was a big raisin and they stopped talking, but they couldn't see me yet as I hadn't walked by the doorway. My office was past their door, so I knew they'd see me eventually as I walked by to get to mine. So I had to make a choice. 1, retrieve the raisin and admit my mistake, or 2, pretend the raisin didn't come from me and walk past, potentially become known as Raisin Boy behind my back. I chose to retrieve the raisin and apologize, but it turns out they didn't even see it bounce in, so to them I just kind of wandered into the room, picked up a raisin off the ground, apologized, and left. I felt like I was in Seinfeld. In short, interrupted a meeting to retrieve my runaway raisin. I was in an interview for an internship after my junior year of college. It was kind of one of those interviews that was less, what are your credentials, and more, when can you start? Knowing this, I was feeling pretty confident and really not too nervous about it. This changed, though, when my interviewer began glancing around and shifting uncomfortably. He was a pretty big guy, so every slight readjustment in his chair was fairly noticeable. It seemed like there was something I'd said or done that had suddenly made him visibly distressed. As if everything was going well, but then I just offhandedly made a grossly inappropriate comment, like a race joke or something. Like I'd just said something that was wildly out of line and just blown right past it. I wondered what it was. I honestly couldn't think of anything. Maybe I was a little too friendly with him. Could that be perceived as being somewhat unprofessional? The interview went on for 5 more minutes as I sat there and thought about what I could have possibly done, and tried my best not to do it again. Rather abruptly, in the middle of my speaking, my interviewer stood up and promptly went number 2. He made brown in his suit. It was a stunning moment. It seemed like he might have suddenly realized that he was dealing with a very, very time-sensitive situation and was frantically trying to get somewhere. But it seems that the basic motor functions of standing up so quickly just forced it all out. It all happened very quick, to be honest. One moment I was explaining how my time as a summer camp counselor had taught me valuable leadership skills, and half a second later my interviewer was on his feet, standing in his own fecal matter. The drastic shift in tone left me completely speechless. Shocked and speechless, I literally didn't know how to respond to the situation. My mock interviews in college had seemingly skipped over this particular instance. All things considered, he handled it okay, I guess. He turned to his office mate and asked her to complete the interview. Oh, and did I mention that he shared an office with an elderly accounting lady, who was an eyewitness to the entire ordeal as well? So, long story short, she finished the interview and I got the job. You know what? Props to them for not being so image-obsessed that they denied a good candidate just for the sake of saving face. These things happen. I've never had a public code brown before, but I hope that when it inevitably happens to me, my onlookers will be as kind and understanding as possible. No shame on that guy. Where I used to work, we had a 9 a.m. PT Wednesday morning meeting. It was that early because half of the team was in California, half was scattered around the East Coast, and one person was in Belgium. So it was early for the West Coast so that it wouldn't be too late for the one guy in frickin' Belgium. The main company office was in California. This was a mid-sized startup with the usual startup culture, so most of the people got in around 10:30. Usually, the office was pretty empty for our meeting. I was one of the remote attendees. About 9:45, the CFO interrupts the meeting and awkwardly asks 4 of the 7 people to come with him. Weird. Then a minute later, he comes back to the remaining 3. He starts by apologizing and saying they were supposed to grab them when they came in, but they were the first ones in. He also apologized that he was about to tell them this as a group, but he wanted to lay it out. Those 3 had been laid off. Why do I know this? Because in the room they had a shared document pulled up on the screen instead of a teleconference. The CFO didn't know they were still broadcasting. Right after the CFO mentioned the layoffs, our Belgium attendee asked, "So, I'm guessing we should leave." I immediately signed off when he said that so that they wouldn't see that I'd waited that long. One of my employees was dialing in from home and hadn't muted his phone. You could hear his dog occasionally barking in the background. A couple of people chimed in, "Well, Rex clearly agrees with that decision," and he didn't get the hint. Then one of his kids started banging pots and pans together and he finally realized he should mute. We're a pretty relaxed bunch and it was an internal call, like no clients on the line, so it was an okay time for him to learn that lesson. I worked at a law firm that was doing a meeting of the senior attorneys and their associates. Some of the senior attorneys were traveling and had to conference in. Here's how that went. "Okay, it looks like we're missing Jim. Can someone get him on the phone? I think I remember his number. I'll call him on my cell." The sound of numbers dialing. "Hello, is this Jim? This is Roger calling about the meeting." "No, this is Dave. Who the hell is Jim?" "Oh, sorry, looks like I have the wrong number." "Yep, looks like it." The sound of hanging up. Maybe I misdialed. Let me try again." The sound of another number dialing. "Hey Jim, this is Hey, frick you, Roger. I already told you my name's Dave." Click. Our inconvenient meeting-killing statement was short, sweet, and to the point. It was as follows. A plane just crashed into the World Trade Center. When I worked at Taco Bell, we were having a quarterly staff meeting to talk about general issues and staff changes, as well as new items coming out, like an extra-large chalupa if I remember correctly. This meeting was happening at 7 a.m. to avoid having to deal with customers being in the lobby as well. A lot of people were annoyed, but I didn't mind because I was getting paid and I got to try the new chalupa. Anyways, halfway through, one of the manager's water broke. She, like all of us, was unaware that she was pregnant. We all just thought she was fat. So, needless to say, she missed her first shift that night and I ended up covering it. Still, a pretty good meeting because of the above-mentioned free chalupa. Glad that I didn't have to mop that morning. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below. And if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. We had one day like that. There was a mass layoff for our tiny little company. A third of my department was let go. They were quietly telling each person individually throughout the morning. At about noon, they called everyone remaining into the large conference room to break the news of what just happened and let us know that everyone not in the room had been let go. Just before the meeting ended, one more person wandered past the door to the conference room, holding their lunch and whistling a happy tune. It turned out that one of the people being let go had already left for lunch when they got to their name on the list and hadn't actually been told yet. It was a whole herd of deer in the headlights there. Never been in a more awkward moment in my life. Again, according to the laws of comedy, I hope that this person saw everyone and laughed before jokingly saying something like, "Hey, what's the matter, guys? You all just get fired? What did I miss, huh?" Two come to mind. The first was an exiting CTO who was leaving under some scandals. I started in the company while he took a month of sick leave after it was discovered that he had bought equipment from our company to use for his personal business. He was apparently a pretty easygoing guy, but as his time started to dwindle, he became more impulsive and irrational. One day, my boss was going over some stuff with us techs about some new procedure. "So, you see, this chart shows how we intend to integrate our..." And the CTO ran into the meeting room Kramer style and drunkenly announced, Anyone who buys a domain in a foreign country needs to see me before they pay with us funds. Not a finger." Then he paused and ran out of the room. "So, this integration will reduce the time needed for cross-department approvals." My boss continued as if nothing had happened. Another one was a CTO having a huge meeting. The meeting room was packed to the walls with dozens more on speakerphone. Sometimes someone dials in, puts the meeting on their speakerphone and forgets to hit mute. And when someone's not paying attention, they don't hear someone screaming to put their call on mute. So you'd hear ka-thumpa thumpa on the keyboard and ring of their private message client at full volume. But you couldn't call anyone out because you didn't know who was doing this out of the dozens that called in. This meeting, it was real bad. The CTO started talking about possible downsizing. Some idiot was on the phone, ka-thumpa thumpa 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 thump of a keyboard, bring, ka-thumpa thumpa thumpa, bring bring. "Can the people on speakerphone hit their mute buttons?" screamed the CTO. Ka-thumpa thumpa bring. Then we heard a cell phone ring. "Hello? Yeah, hi Tom. Oh, nothing. What's up?" So we heard this guy talk to his friend about a new BMW he bought and how he Jewed the salesperson down for a deal. The CTO was Jewish, and now real mad. He hung up on the call after telling anyone to listen to call back in. Later, he grilled departments to see who recently brought a new car. Quickly, the BMW owner was located in a distant office 20 miles away. He was banned from using a speakerphone and had to drive in for every meeting and report in person. I was once in a private meeting discussing whether to hire an applicant. Someone realized they left a sheet of paper at their desk, got up and opened the door to go get it. As soon as the door was open, an uninvited manager fell through the doorway. He had been right outside, pressing his ear against the door to listen in. In the middle of a meeting last year, the lady speaking passed out and hit the floor, microphone still in hand. We helped her up. After 10 minutes, she resumed speaking and blacked out again. We helped her up. She continues to finish the meeting while laying on the floor. What the frick meeting was so important that you had to do that? "If I die here, I just wanted you all to know. Congratulations to Jim, your employee of the month." Ugh. I was at a job interview and the interviewer had to go because Mike Pence randomly showed up in the building. I'm going to have to say it was the time that the general manager of my resort shot a rubber band across the room and it hit the wedding coordinator right between the eyes. It made for a very interesting staff meeting afterwards. I was alone in my office on a conference when over the intercom a polite female voice said, and I'll never forget these words, "Attention all staff. Armed intruders have gained access to the building." I remember thinking, this has got to be a drill, but it was at a weird time for a drill, shortly after 1 p.m. when many people were still at lunch. So I took it seriously and hung up the phone, locked my door, grabbed some scissors. Look, I know, but Christ, I had to have something. My friends really laughed at me for that, jerks. And I hid in the corner behind a big cabinet. It was eerily quiet for the next 10 to 15 minutes. I texted some friends who I knew were still out to lunch to not come back to the office. Eventually, another 10 to 15 minutes later, another announcement was made that there was no threat and the building was safe. It turned out that the security staff were updating the emergency announcements, and one of the guys, I joke you not, bumped the armed intruder announcement. Whoops! Well, thankfully it was a false alarm. It was not a small event. Some people were truly terrified. A couple of people collapsed and had to be taken to hospital. My favorite of the whole thing was that it was a lockdown strategy. Our building, it turns out, has automated steel doors that would slam shut and protect anyone in the wings until the cops cleared the building. Assuming, you're not trapped inside there with a fricking dude with an AK, so it wasn't an evacuation strategy. That said, there were numerous stories of our vice presidents running out of the building like goddamn George Costanza. So much for leadership. In follow-up meetings, the security team stressed that since there are only a few obvious points of exit from the building, they make for perfect kill zones, so, don't do what the bosses did. I was at a school board meeting once for work. The board is moving through the agenda in the typical boring way when some woman got up and started screaming about how she had no kids and should not have to pay school tax. One of the board members was trying to tell her that the high-rated public schools increased her home value. But nope, she just kept screaming at the top of her lungs until the super old security guard walked over and told her to leave or he'd have to call the local cops. The old libertarians causing problems again, I see. I hear about these weirdos in every public assembly, citizens meeting, and often see them in opinion pieces or letters to the editor. You morons benefit from these taxes, directly or indirectly, the same way as this woman does. Just pay your due and get a better hobby than screaming in public for attention. You're just bored. I was pretty new to the company and was at my third or fourth department meeting. There was another manager there, a very attractive woman my age. Well, she sits down at this meeting in a rush. She was the very last to arrive. She was carrying a bottle of seltzer water with her to drink. She opens the seltzer and it explodes all over the entire conference table, soaking all of us. I laughed, she laughed, some others laughed, and some didn't. I'll never forget it. I asked her out about 2 months afterwards. Now our daughter is a junior in high school. In high school, I'd joined a Boy Scouts Explorers post at the local newspaper. A reporter had started up the group with the BSA and was teaching a bunch of high schoolers how to be reporters. We met at the paper weekly, and the paper gave us a page periodically that we were able to fill with whatever content we wanted, within obvious reason and generally accepted newspaper standards. I was at the weekly meeting, and the topic that week was press conferences, specifically how to ask what kinds of questions to get whatever information you need to get. So the reporter had dressed up as a baseball player and was giving a press conference for being the first woman to be signed to a Major League Baseball team. We were firing off questions and she was answering, and all was going pretty well. With zero warning, of course, a bearded guy busted into the room screaming at her about something she had done to annoy him. He grabbed her and took her out of the room. So all we could do was hear him yelling and screaming, and we were all frozen 15 and 16-year-olds wondering what the frick to do. Finally, they came back into the room laughing. It was all a setup to teach us about our observational skills. What did the guy look like? What was he wearing? What was he yelling about? Etc. That was a powerful lesson as a young reporter, because we learned that even when 20 people witness the same event, there'll be 20 different opinions about what just happened. So you have to ask a lot of people the same questions to start to pull together an accurate picture of what had gone down. This was back in the 80s, and no way in heck would such a thing fly now. Parents would lose their damn minds, but I will never forget that meeting. In a meeting with pastries, one coworker says, "Oh, donuts." Another one pipes in, "Don't take the cream-filled one, it's the boss's favorite." The coworker takes the cream-filled donut, takes a bite, and smiles directly at the boss. The boss walked over, reached across the boardroom table, grabs the donut, mushes it in the provocateur's face, sits down, and resumes the meeting. Ooh, it was me! I was the interruption. I had a crappy boss that loved meetings. In one of them, her and this other guy got into a discussion, and after about 15 minutes I said, "Can I leave? This has nothing to do with me and I have work to do." The other 20 people in the room thanked me privately and said they couldn't believe I didn't get fired. Not my meeting, and memorable, but not in a good way. I worked at a small company, just 3 people. I answered the phone one random afternoon, and the caller, someone I was familiar with, asked for my boss. I said the usual line about being in a meeting and can I take a message. He said, "Interrupt him now, please." The caller was not prone to drama, so I suspected it was important and got my boss. He was calling to tell us a photographer we'd worked with was killed, alongside another photographer while working in Libya. That was one of the most surreal days of my working life. Worked at a dog-friendly office and we had an all-staff meeting, so about 20 people and probably about 8 dogs. HR was in the middle of a presentation when a 30-pound dog, A corgi mix, so long and skinny with short legs, jumped up in an office desk chair sitting up by itself towards the front, and it starts spinning, and spinning, and spinning. It spun for over a minute and everyone was just losing it. The dog's face said, "F this." I've never laughed so hard in a meeting in my life. We had a board meeting at a church where they also hold various other meetings. My friend walked into AA with a six-pack of beer thinking it was our board meeting. I was working for a popular restaurant in high school. There was a meeting at 8 a.m. on the first Saturday of the month. The only person absent was the head chef, a guy, and the line cook, a woman, both of whom had closed the night before. They walked in together halfway through the meeting looking like they just woke up. The line cook had a rubber stuck to her shoe. Everyone knew exactly what went on last night. What was your 1 in a million chance that you made and blew everyone's mind? I was taping some tracing wire to a natural gas line that we were installing. When I pulled the wire tight, it snapped against the pipe and it ended up hitting a wasp that was on the pipe, perfectly beheading it. Beheading? I ran out of gas while driving at full speed once and managed to coast over a mile and come to a stop right at a gas pump. I had a lot on my mind. I was going through a divorce, you see, and simply just didn't think about filling the gas tank. I didn't even notice I was out of gas until I felt the acceleration was no longer working. I turned down my music just in time to hear the engine sputter out. I quickly popped my car into neutral, turned on the hazard lights, and began coasting as long as I could. By the time I reached the gas station, I was doing about 4 miles per hour and had just enough momentum to make it up the embankment and to the pump. I didn't even brake until my gas cap was adjacent to the nozzle. Freshman year of high school, I was talking to a friend, walking in the hallway, chewing gum. The gum flew out of my mouth accidentally, and I panicked and kicked my foot hacky sack style and kicked the gum right back into my mouth. My friend said it was gross to keep chewing the foot gum, but I said it was an act of God. I was playing kickball in my neighborhood street with a bunch of friends and a few cute girls around. I was always pretty good, so people always backed up when I was kicking. I got pitched the ball, and when I kicked it, it soared up into the air, up the street, and straight into my friend's basketball hoop. It was a good 35 yards away. The sound it made was the best swish I've ever heard. To this day, I've never made that shot again. I was sitting in a bar one time next to a pool table. The guy knocked the cue ball off, knocked the beer out of my hand, but I caught the ball. Everything was fine. The guy bought me another round. I was playing beer pong with some friends at the shore. The ball got a dent in it, so I was thinking, I'm hot stuff. I'm going to try the old lighter trick to pop the dent out. Well, as it turns out, if you get the lighter too close, the ball just catches on fire rather quickly. So instead of dropping the ball or blowing it out, I tossed the ball and sank the final cup with a flaming ball of glory. It might not be a 1 in a million shot, but it sure felt like one. I imagine the awesome factor was somewhat lessened for whoever had to drink the awful cocktail of beer and toxic burnt plastic. But you know what? If you're already a few rounds in at that point, then that's the kind of thing you might do anyway. Play on, folks. I was shooting at 2-liter bottles in New Hampshire with a BB shooter without much success. I decided I'd gangster things up a bit and turned the weapon on its side and fired. I hit the bottle at just the right spot so that the BB bounced back and hit me in the forehead. Also, one time my cousin threw a boomerang and it came back and hit him in the forehead. We have big foreheads. 5 heads? My dad once decided it would be really interesting to try and throw 2 boomerangs at once, so he stacked them together and had at it, and it worked perfectly at first. During flight, the boomerangs had separated, one moving ahead and slightly above the second. I was well back out of the return zone. My brother, however, was right up next to our dad, so when they came back he was in the line of fire, and being rather young, he hadn't really mastered catching a boomerang and decided getting out of the way was the best option. He ducked under the first, only to have the second one catch him squarely in the face when he stood up. I remember a lot of screaming, but no permanent damage was done. The next day, not having learned our lesson, I caught my granddad in the back with a poorly thrown boomerang. Those things are dangerous, mate. I was playing baseball when I was around 10. I think I was playing first base and wasn't paying attention, and all of a sudden, a ball landed in my glove without me realizing. The pitcher threw it and the batter hit a straight line drive to me. I'll never be able to do that again, even if I try. I was miles away from home. I crossed the road behind a bus when a car came down the other side of the road and nearly knocked me over. I was okay, the car was braking. I hadn't looked where I was walking and just popped out behind the bus, so I expected the owner of the car to yell at me. I looked up and lo and behold, it was my dad, driving home from the shop. It must have been 1,000,000 to 1 odds that it was him, as I live in quite a large city. Also, I learned my lesson about crossing behind buses, and he gave me a lift home. I flipped a coin in my garage and it got stuck in the rafters. I walked away, disappointed. 5 days later, I was walking to my car and it fell down into the shoe I was wearing. I had my phone connected to its charging cord once and I was holding it and accidentally dropped it. The cord caught on the side of my end table, making the phone do an Indiana Jones-style vine swing on the cord. When it reached the apex of its swing, it detached from the cord, spun in the air, and landed upright in the seat of my chair facing me. I actually thought it was sentient for a second. Oh, I'm very glad my story will never happen again. I was walking into the pool room of a pub to join my friends sitting in the corner. As I opened the door, time slowed down. I noticed an exquisite detail just how the person taking their shot mucked it up, sending the ball flying. I saw the perfect parabola of the cue ball in the air tracing the curve of its majestic flight, right into my family jewels. Ouch. I was waitressing, and one evening when carrying out food, I tripped and fell. One plate just dropped all over the floor, smashing into 1,000,000 pieces of food and china. The other plate slid across the floor and came to a stop right next to the foot of the customer who had ordered that meal. In middle school, my friends and I were joking around. I forget exactly what about, but for some reason I'd said something about hiding a body in a locker, and I turned to the nearest locker, the kind with a combination lock built in. I playfully tried to open it up as part of the joke. I randomly twisted the lock and pulled the handle, and the damn thing just opened. And inside was a black garbage bag with something big inside. I was completely floored by my dumb luck. They thought I'd planned it. Also, the first thing we found when we opened the bag was clothes, which freaked us out, but then it was just a bunch of notebooks and stuff. Phew. I was acting in a play and whipped my head to the right to react to what another character was saying. This was something I did every night in rehearsals, but for some reason, on opening night, my glasses shot right off my face. They just went flying. I have no idea, but I immediately caught them with my already outstretched hand. The audience ate that up. They applauded like this was a tricky maneuver I'd practiced every night. But it was literally something I could never do again. 2 minutes later, I whipped my head to the left to react to another character, and the glasses went airborne again, smacking the actress in the face and falling behind a prop so that they couldn't be easily recovered. The first time I ever played 2048 and won. I thought that was incredibly easy and didn't play again for a while. Since then, it's become increasingly popular and I realized that what I'd done was actually quite a feat. I've since played countless times and I'm convinced that given 1,000,000 tries, I'll never win again. Well, the narrator read this comment, decided to go and try this game mid-recording, set his entire schedule back by half an hour and got less than 1/16 of the required score to win. That game seems very hard to me, so well done you! I believe I was 13 years old at the time. I was fishing off the dock of my parents' beach house. I went to cast and released the fishing line into the air. A seagull was flying by at the exact time and the hook got attached to the bird. I caught a mother-frickin' seagull with my fishing rod. I tried to reel the seagull in to remove the hook from its mouth, but the bird was having none of that. It was kind of flying like a kite until I decided to cut the fishing line. Years ago, I was ice skating when I saw a group of my school friends. They were obviously there for the first time and kind of shuffle sliding out to the center of the rink in a group of 4 without taking their feet off the ice. I was still new at this too and not very good, but I skated over to say hello. As I came up in front of them, I realized I was going too fast and tried to slow down, and I overbalanced. I fell forward with my hand out. The heel of my hand landed on the ice, and I did a perfect circle about 8 foot wide around it with my skates opposed to each other before I managed to remove my hand and stand upright again. Frickin' show-off, one of my friends grumbled. I was walking into the men's room while chewing gum and realized I didn't want the gum anymore. I spat the gum out and kicked it mid-air into a tiny bin about 10 meters away. Made me feel like Zlatan. I once squashed a fly mid-air with a sausage tong. The 5 or so family members that were there didn't even believe me when I showed them the fly remains on the tip of the tongs. This is my single greatest achievement in life. When I was just a young lad, I was eating a meatball when my friend said something funny. A chunk of meatball about the size of a small marble was thrust from my nose like a cannon. My friend's dog caught the meaty marble mid-air and ate it. I peaked too early, you guys. When I was in high school, I was talking to a friend in the gym after school while chewing gum. She turned her head while I was talking, and just as she did, I accidentally spit my gum directly at her temple. I snapped my hand out in front of me, caught the gum, put it back in my mouth, just as she turned back. Didn't notice at all. I silently applauded my sudden onset spidey reflexes and went on with the conversation as if nothing had happened. I kicked a volleyball into a trash can about 100 feet away. There were witnesses. Casually dropped 2 coins on a table when the one coin started spinning on top of the other, slowing down to a halt, still standing sideways. I've tried to do it again, but it's absolutely impossible. My ex-girlfriend and I were leaving the local coffee shop. I drove away without knowing she left her phone on the roof. Made the turn onto a busy main street, and through the crack of her open window, the phone flew in and landed in her lap. What a frickin' shock. She lost it maybe 2 weeks later. I still don't know what wonder of physics made that happen. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below. And if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. 4 a.m. I was hungry, so I went to Dunkin' Donuts. I grabbed whatever money I have in the car, turns out to be $4.63. So I go make my usual order completely oblivious to the fact that I have no money. The register shows my total, $4.63 frickin' cents. I just emptied my hand to the dude at the counter. He knows what just happened and gave me a nod of approval. I drove away with my donuts and wraps like a mother frickin' boss. I was playing football or soccer in a park with about 6 or 7 friends when a family walked by and the eldest daughter, who must have been at least 20, shouted that, "If that fricking ball comes near me, I will pop it." I considered this to be completely rude and uncalled for, as we were just playing a nice game in the middle of a park. As the family walked away, I could see her walking like she was some frickin' awesome B-word for throwing out a needless threat to a bunch of kids. So I thought to myself, I'm gonna teach this lady. So I took the ball in my hands and kicked it towards her, assuming, because I'm not at all athletic or skilled, that it would go nowhere near her. But by some divine intervention, it conked her straight on the head from 50 yards. The rest of the family laughed really hard at her, so she was too embarrassed to steal the ball and pop it, and her dad threw it back to us. I was carrying 2 punnets of raspberries to the counter in the supermarket when the top one slid off and fell. It rotated 360 degrees and I dropped to my knees and caught it on top of the remaining punnet. Well, I can tell the author here is under a certain age because my knees were already cracking in sympathy. I don't care if I'm dropping a priceless porcelain vase, there is no way in hell I'm dropping knees first into a hard floor voluntarily. I got a house under contract to buy at $42,000. On the drive back to my office, I stopped to let a farmer know that one of his cows was out of the fence by the highway. He thanked me and saw my shirt that said, "I buy houses," and he asked me if I had any for sale. I said, yes. It was the one I'd just gotten under contract. I sold it to him for $60K. I made $15,000 in about 3 hours of work. 2 things for me. First, I was driving on the highway after a very bad winter storm, lots of ice. My car started doing the wiggle. Next thing I know, I'm spinning. I screamed out of reflex and saw the guy driving in the car next to me with his shocked face. I landed perfectly straight and kept going. I'll never forget that guy's face, and I'll never forget the pair of pants that I lost that day. And the second? Well, I was playing World Series Baseball on the Sega Genesis, so like 1994, 95, my cousin was kicking my butt. He had the bases loaded and was down by 1 point, 0 outs. Hits a line dive and I made my short stop dive for it, but instead of diving forward, he did his dive where his body was facing the wrong direction, so he sort of dove backwards towards the ball, then proceeded to get a triple play. I ended up winning. We watched the replay of my triple play for like 30 minutes. It was so unbelievable. Finally, my brother. We went to a house party and just got hammered. We were playing quarters, the game where you bounce quarters off a table into a shot glass. I don't even remember the rules. I just remember doing that. Looking around the table, there was a guy with a paper bag on his head and another guy with a lampshade on. Everyone was just smashed. My brother says, "If I land this, you all have to chug hard liquor. If I lose, I'll do it," and proceeds to fill glasses with hard liquor. He puts down 2 shot glasses and everyone is thinking there's no way he'll land 2. He then tilts his head back and puts the quarters over his eyes, slams his head forward and lands both quarters in both shot glasses. The table erupts. Chairs are thrown backwards and broken, eruption of screaming. I ended up blacking out thanks to the large amounts of Beefeater I drank that night. Good times. Back when I was new to Street Fighter, my friend invited me to a tournament. The thing is, I didn't know how to play. I won by mashing buttons. $200. I could never do that again even if I tried knowing the game better. I guessed an activation code for a Flight Simulator 98 game that I stole. No joke. One of the first times I played Zombies Call of Duty online, I made it to level 40. I tried and tried many times later and never made it past 30. Oh, there was this one time. Back when I was just this little white fishy guy fresh out of my dad, I penetrated this huge frickin' thing and got born. This one time, I saw the DVD logo hit the corner of the screen. My mouth fired saliva like a water gun once, no idea why. I thought I was a Pokemon. I was in a musical a few years ago and one of the characters had to drop some coins. All goes well for the first few nights, then one night he drops them and one rolls down the stairs and halfway down the theatre to the audience, whereupon it stops at the feet of a 3-year-old girl who at this point realizes she is the chosen one and has magic powers, and screams loudly and excitedly for an impressive amount of time during the rest of the play. Yay! At my ex-girlfriend's new loft apartment, it was 2 stories with the main living area, kitchen and stuff downstairs and the bedroom upstairs with a half wall, I used to throw things off her upstairs wall at her cat. Socks, primarily. One day I had a nickel in my pocket and I noticed an open, half-full Snapple bottle on the other side of the room downstairs, so like 15 feet away and 10 feet below me. I asked if she bet me I couldn't make it in. She humored me and said, "Sure, what's the bet?" I said, "If I miss, I'll never throw anything downstairs again." And if I made it, she had to give me a down-under kiss and swallow, which she hated, right then and there on the couch. She also hated doing anything on the couch. My girlfriend accepted. I fully expected to miss, but I lined up, did a couple of fake pumps and threw it. 2 seconds later, you heard the perfect clink and kasploosh. I ran around the apartment celebrating like I got the winning goal in OT in Game 7 of the Stanley Cup, and my girlfriend even paid up. In short, I threw a nickel into an open Snapple bottle 15 feet away and 10 feet below me. I got some action. I'm Australian. It was just a normal summer day and I'd finished eating an icy pole and still had the stick in my hand. I walked into the games room to play the PlayStation when I saw there was a huge white-tailed spider sitting on the wall. I said, "Screw this," and casually tossed the stick towards it. Somehow it hit like a spear right between the abdomen and main body and sliced it clean in half. The spider didn't even move. Its abdomen and the stick fell to the floor and it was left dead sitting on the wall. I 360 no-scoped a bottle into a rubbish bin at school once. My life can only go downhill from there. Is there any other way than no-scoping when it comes to throwing a bottle? The person who asked this last question makes a valid point, but still, the act of successfully hitting anything with an aimed projectile after a 360 turn in mid-air is impressive. Maybe not 1,000,000 to 1 impressive like some of these others, but hey, if that's the high point of your life, well done you. I played hockey when I was younger and I was terrible. I was 4th line forward, who maybe scored 1 garbage goal per season. I was skating out of my zone and I shot the puck from center ice to go on a line change, and I ended up sniping it top right side. I didn't even see the puck go in because immediately after I shot it, I was skating to the bench to complete the change. I asked junior Senator Barack Obama at the time he was campaigning for presidency to take my phone that already had my mother on the other line and wish her a happy birthday. He talked to her for about 3 minutes while his security guards mouthed "F you" and basically resembled exaggerated cartoon bullies. They apparently didn't like the idea of this and made it more than clear. I'd once lost a DS game. After hours of searching, I still couldn't find it. My room then could be described as a pigsty, so I had no idea where it could be. In a fit of rage, I kicked a pile of clothes as high as I possibly could. Most of them fell on my own head, and when I shook my head to get them off, the DS game fell out of the pile and onto my DS, which was sitting on my bed. Okay, hold on to your socks, people. I think I've got the craziest one. I correctly inserted a flash drive into a USB port on the first try. I was in a hotel parking lot, about to leave Vermont and head home from my friend's wedding. I was with a couple of friends, hopping into my car when I noticed my empty juice bottle from the ride up was on the floor of the car. I see a trash can all the way at the beginning of the parking lot, back by the hotel, maybe 50 to 60 feet away. A couple of things. First, this trash can had a top on it, and 2, this bottle was completely empty plastic, with very little weight to it. Basically, I was going to have to hurl it as hard as I could to even get close. I have no idea if I can even throw it far enough. So I said something along the lines of, "Check out this, motherfuckers," and chucked the bottle in a majestic parabola shape towards the trash can. It must have hit an updraft or something because it made it all the way. It hit the outer rim, spun a full time around the rim, and then dropped into the hole beautifully. Best throw of my life. Did I mention there were about 4 or other 5 carloads of people in the parking lot at that very moment? I proceeded to sprint around the parking lot, arms out like an airplane, high-fiving everyone in the parking lot who was getting in their cars. I swatted a bee with my hand and somehow removed its head. I am the king of the north. As a side note, the body kept moving for like another 15 minutes. That twitch made me nervous. I live next to a golf course, so when golf balls fly into our yard, I hit them back. One day I had 2 balls fly in, so I took my 7-iron, and instead of flying over back to the golf course, I smacked it right into a telephone pole, and the ball came flying back at me. I had to swat it away with my left hand. I kinda chuckled and hit the second ball, and the same exact thing happened. Whew. What's a dumb local rumor you heard as a kid that turned out to be true? The US Midwest. Rumor has it that up the old road out of town, somewhere in the woods, was a satanic cult that held seances and other mystical rituals by firelight. It scared the willies out of us kids, and our parents wouldn't let us ride our bikes anywhere on that road. Decades later, I was working on a commissioned history project for the town and talked to the old man who owned the oldest homestead in the country, way back in the woods along that road. While photographing the creek that ran through the stone foundation basement of the home, which the settlers used for water generations ago, I noted the burnt-out tea candles everywhere. Guy lit up and said, yeah, back in his younger days, he and his wife used to host elaborate costume parties at the property, often by candlelight for the fun of it. He had heard rumors of the satanic cult and thought it was hilarious, so he and his friends ran with it and held parties in monks' robes and had bonfires and lived it up. He still laughs about it, and now so can I. This older kid had this lightning streak scar all over one side of his neck and down his body. The rumor was he was throwing stuff at the power lines behind our neighborhood. Turns out he was. He was throwing copper wire at them and it arced. He's lucky to be alive. A vagrant-looking man used to collect cans from local parks and whatnot. Imagine someone pushing a shopping cart in tattered clothing. Rumor was that he was generationally wealthy, and when he passed away he left a fortune to the Parks and Rec department to update facilities. We used to have a local homeless lady, supposedly a Vietnam Army nurse. Her experiences there ruined her and she refused help from her wealthy family. It was all rumors though until she passed. Her family turned out to be the people who owned Utz potato chips. They paid for her funeral since now she wasn't around to refuse any money or help anyone. This is a little more light-hearted, but when I was in elementary school, probably like 3rd grade, all the kids in my class would joke about how our primary teacher and our Spanish teacher liked each other. We were all little kids, so of course it was just a dumb little kids joking around thing. That is until a few years later when I was in middle school and I found out my old teacher and Spanish teacher recently got married. Thank you for posting the story of a cute little after-school romance blossoming into a marriage. And there was another one to immediately follow that story. Yeah, this happened to me twice. I think my radar for teacher romances was excellent. My grade 5 teacher was a very awkward man. Kind, but weird. We had a substitute teacher every once in a while who was recently divorced. A stunning lady with her 3-piece outfits, sculpted cheekbones, and big eyes. I swore in grade 6 that they were dating, but I couldn't prove it, and no one would believe me. That is until my oldest was in grade 1 and I was in the class to ask the teacher a question. I realized immediately that this was Mrs. Y, my substitute from 20 years earlier, and that she'd in fact been dating and then married my grade 5 teacher. Then there was the high school one. My advanced math teacher was an awkward woman, kind of geeky but weird. We also had a substitute teacher who was geeky but tall and handsome with gorgeous blonde hair. For a reason you'll see soon, we'll call him Mr. X. I was in an all-girls high school, so girls being girls, we all fawned over him. By grade 11, I swore that their casual chit-chat in the hallway was making date plans after school, but I still couldn't prove it either. Part of my stand-up bit for a grade 12 Frosh week was introducing teachers to the new students, and I welcomed those teachers as Mr. and future Mrs. X. A few years later, they were married. Both couples are still happily together. The first couple are now enjoying retirement. In 2008 or so, a guy we knew was shot at the park by adult substance dealers. The news and reports stated that he was a kingpin in the green herb trade and had made tens of thousands before getting popped. His parents denied, of course, until investigation found out that he started selling to pay his parents' mortgage, and he had in fact been selling large quantities of green herb. The park we used to play football at used to be a cemetery. They'd exhumed all the coffins and moved them years before I was born. We'd freak each other out, especially at night, saying there were still bodies buried there. One day we were playing and they were doing some groundskeeping work and they found a coffin. The state came out and found 30 more. We were actually playing on top of hallowed ground. I'd heard about 2 different teachers at my high school being creepy, and they've both since been fired for inappropriate contact with students. There was a rumor at my high school that the building down the way was a cult. It wasn't unheard of to dare people to go over there, and then you'd end up being followed or sometimes invited to dinner. Turns out it was the HQ of the cult the Duggars were in, the Institute in Basic Life Principles. I was watching that documentary and my mind was blown, because all of the high school rumors had been true. There was a taco truck in town that sold green herb if you asked for a side of lettuce. I hope everyone who asked was actually hoping for the devil's lettuce instead of iceberg, because it was true. There was this jerk in my junior high gym class, a real bully type, and when he'd act out, everyone would ridicule him for his mother being a smack-using working girl, and we'd laugh and laugh and laugh and laugh and laugh. Well, it turned out it was true. There was public confirmation in the paper, and his bullying made a lot more sense because it turned out his home life was what you'd expect from someone having a mother like that, and no one talked about it anymore, and we didn't laugh so much. Ironically, I think he felt so ashamed when everyone found out, he actually stopped being such a jerk. When I was a child, we had the legend of the Baroness. Supposedly, she lived in a haunted house and drove around a pink hearse. When I was old enough to drive and explore on my own, I finally saw her, in her pink hearse. She also lived in a house that would have coded as spooky or haunted to a small child. It was just an old house with neat architecture. That there was a secret cult in one of the neighborhoods turned out to be true. It was NXIVM, a cult. That if you rode bikes or four-wheelers down a certain trail, an old man would come after you and attack you. A few years later, some people were riding four-wheelers down the trail and an old guy shot and killed them both. Damnedest thing, they'd already left his property before he caught up to them, and he killed them on public land. I'm pretty sure he died in prison a few years ago. There was a kid in my middle school class who was a real jerk to everyone, struggled through simple classwork, and was good at sports but fought so much they'd hardly let him play. One day he pushed it too far and the whole class decided to mock him for the jersey he wore to school every day, and how he only wore undershirts and the same 2 pairs of pants. No gym clothes either, and a ratty pair of shoes. Turns out his parents were alcoholic crap piles and he lived with his very old grandmother and basically raised himself. Couldn't afford clothes and barely got enough from her social security to feed the both of them. Found out when me and a couple of friends found him sobbing in the bushes after school because he didn't want to go home and worry his gran. Some guys ended up buying him some clothes and helped him get some cleats to play soccer. My mum let me buy him lunches on my account too, since the free school lunch was basically a piece of bread with a half slice of cheese and a wilted apple. The guy is a financial manager now and doing pretty well. Rumor about a local businessman who tried to end it all and was rescued. Some weeks later, he ran into a burning building and rescued 2 young children, sustaining severe burns in the process. A few months ago, I saw him in the pub on the green. All the skin on his face and hands had melted, and he had skin grafts everywhere. Happiest man in the pub. What a hero! That our neighbor was an unspeakable act offender of the worst sort. Married with kids, too. Sadly, it turned out to be true. One day he dropped dead of a heart attack, and when the family started going through his stuff, they were so disgusted apparently they just sold the house as is, with the furniture and everything. Always heard rumors that this kid who I rode BMX with, his dad was a high-ranking member of the Hells. One day we were over, years later, talking crap around the fire in his backyard, and about 70 patched members arrived at the house for a meeting. They brought us a crap load of beer and told us to find a park to drink it in for the next few hours while they had their meeting. Not gonna lie, if someone's dad did that for our group of friends, we'd think they were the coolest kid in school afterwards. Also, it's a little funny that these guys got you out of their hair by getting you to go do illegal underage drinking somewhere else. They probably could have just told you to leave and you'd be so scared that you'd do it. I have 2, both about elderly men. First, there was an elderly man that could be seen walking all over town. Long grey beard, usually seen in tattered clothes. Walking Man or the Silver Bullet were nicknames for him. The rumor was that he was actually really wealthy, but lots of people just assumed he was homeless because he was always walking, carrying groceries or whatever. Well, about a year before he passed away, it came out that he was actually one of the wealthiest residents in our town when he donated millions to local youth programs and schools. Turns out he just liked walking a lot and placed no value on material things like clothes and cars. Second, there was an elderly man who was actually homeless. The rumor was that he drank himself crazy some years back and just never got help. He was in and out of jail a bunch but always seemed to be given some slack by law enforcement. The truth is tragic. He did indeed drink himself crazy, but out of necessity. He was a paramedic. One night he responded to a wreck that turned out to be his wife and daughter. They'd been hit by a distracted driver speeding on a narrow road. Neither survived. Understandably, he was never okay after that. He'd sometimes check the pizza shop I used to manage for spare slices. Broke my heart that all I could really do was offer him some free pizza. I hope you rest in peace now, Red. A kid in my 3rd grade class was always late to school. I'm talking he showed up to school 5 minutes before classes were released to go home once. The rumor amongst parents and teachers was that his mum was an alcoholic and the dad lived a couple of towns over. So he often had to wait for his dad to take him or care for his mum until she was well enough to drive. This was a private school with no bus, by the way. She died of liver failure a few months ago, according to Facebook. It makes it so much more messed up that everyone knew, including a teacher, and didn't have any sympathy for him. I distinctly remember the teacher telling him on multiple occasions that it was his responsibility to show up on time. He was 8. Was he supposed to drive himself? It makes me so sad. I hope he's doing okay now. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below. And if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. That a quiet and polite guy we knew growing up was a murderous and ruthless gang leader. We used to go to his parties. We saw him out on the town and always exchanged pleasantries. We would see him at the bar and there was little indication that he wasn't to be messed with until one day we bumped into him in a parking lot. Again, just exchanging pleasantries. How are you? What's going on this weekend? Stuff like that. A truck pulled up a couple of spots over from us. This guy goes, "Hold on just a sec," and calmly walked over to talk to the guy. A short conversation ensued and he opened the door and started just pummeling the guy. Like on top of him in the driver's seat, punching down. We were stunned. After a short while, he got out of the truck and walked back to calmly finish his conversation with us like nothing had happened. We saw the truck pull away, so the guy lived. A few years afterwards, more rumors surfaced about him, and it made sense that they were true, until one day his arrest made international headline news. He received a heavy sentence for a ton of different crimes, likely won't ever be free, and his affiliates are still doing business. There was a summer camp in East Tennessee that my scout troop used to go to that was out of council, so we had to be invited. And there was this hike that was part of the first year's class, a class that was pretty much how not to die at summer camp. It took you to this beautiful overlook that gave you gorgeous views of the valley and the part of the Appalachians we were in. The thing is, this overlook was outside of camp property, or so we were told, so they had to get permission every time they took the kids out of there, and the area was strictly off limits to everyone. Of course, rumors and legends were everywhere in this camp, and being the mid-2000s, one of them was that if you went to the overlook at night, the lights in the valley below spelled gay. Keep in mind, gay was a funny word back then, and everything among middle and high school boys was called gay. Now, we'd heard this legend for years, and one year, due to the shenanigans my troop got up to, we were told we wouldn't be invited back the following year. So, a couple of my friends got together on the last night of camp and said, "You know what? If we don't go tonight, we'll never be able to confirm or deny the legend, so let's sneak out and put this thing to rest." So, we snuck out after lights out, took the 2 or 3 mile hike to get out to the overlook, and I swear, right hand to God, the lights below actually spelled out in messy but clearly legible letters, capital G, capital A, capital Y. We all just kind of stood there for a few minutes in stunned silence because absolutely none of us expected it to be even partially true, and I'm sure no one believed us when we told them and thought we were perpetuating a lie, but I swear it actually said that. Everyone at my school knew someone else who told them that this one house just down the road from the school was owned by a locally known substance dealer, and it was his emergency hideout house. Years later, I was driving past and laughed at how ridiculous the story was. And 2 weeks after that, the house was on the news with armed police surrounding it. Turns out it really was this substance hideout, and the guy was involved in way more stuff than just that. They found substances, weapons, and evidence of a human trafficking ring right in there. The house got mysteriously burned down while this court case was going on and has been a burned-out, empty lot ever since. The 2 women in their late 40s were actually homosexual. Everyone on our street believed them when they told everyone they were sisters. I used to run errands for them maybe 3 times a week, and they always gave me a shilling every time. Well, given that shillings were phased out in the UK at least in the 1970s, it probably makes sense that they'd pretend to be roommates or sisters or whatever for the time. It's a damn shame they had to hide who they were, but it's not the first time the narrator has heard of a story like this. The kids would tell stories, and one that reaccrued was about the young woman that killed her parents with scissors. In a town of 300 in an isolated area, nothing ever happened, so even as a kid it was easy to dismiss. My senior year, my class found out that our teacher told us all the details. He was the only person in the county with a color camera, so he was drafted as the official crime scene photographer. It was during a cold snap, so at the same time state police arrived, the scene was frozen. The temperature was so low that our teacher's camera froze up and he had to fake it, then return later with the sheriff to retake the pictures. The girl had a home life that I can only describe as horrific for a number of reasons. So one night she did them in their sleep, with a pair of scissors. She dragged the bodies to the garage and attempted to burn them, but the only thing she had that was combustible was some perfume. She then came up with a story and ran to the neighbors. Turns out she was sent to the state mental hospital. It was a local urban legend that this huge, old, abandoned house was haunted because like a century ago there was a murder there. Kids would freak each other out over it, tell ghost stories, sneak into the property, whatever. I thought it was just that, an urban legend about an abandoned house. Nope. In the early 1900s, the husband and wife were found dead in the house. It was never solved, but the son was suspected because he was missing and never found. No one moved into it after that, and it's sat empty ever since. I only found out because they planned to tear it down to build apartments on the property 2 years ago, but the local community rallied to preserve it. That tight biking turn at the bottom of the hill everyone called Dead Man's Curve because someone died there? Someone did indeed die there. The rumor that our local China buffet was using illegal immigrants as waitstaff and then trafficking them across town to a massage parlor that they owned. It was true. Huge scandal when it happened, but it was hushed up pretty quickly. The restaurant reopened some months after under new management. A kid at my school whose mum disappeared when he was a baby was rumored that she was killed by Ted Bundy. Decades later, researchers think it's actually true. When I was a little kid, like 7, and roaming around the neighborhood with my gang of little rascals, this was in the 50s when kids could safely play outside all day with their pals without parental worry, there was a rumor that in the house 2 doors over from mine that the parents had locked their mentally handicapped kid in the attic and that he was one of my gang friends' older brothers. We played with him, but he always denied that he had any siblings. We were never allowed to enter his house, which was strange because we were always stopping at our other friends' homes during our days to drink water or use the bathroom. About 2 years later, the boy and his family moved away never to be seen again. But when they moved, it was discovered that yes, an older brother did exist, and he was kept locked away in the attic. It was a very creepy discovery. Mental health awareness and acceptance was in the dark ages in the 1950s. I grew up where there were some signs of Native Americans. I started believing that this one particularly beautiful spot had to be sacred and probably was a burial ground. I'd convinced my friends to hold hands in a circle and try to commune with the dead. After I got a bit older, I was super embarrassed that I'd ever done such things. A few years later, a Native American came by and told us how sacred the land was that we owned, and asked permission to hold peyote rituals with his tribe and others on our land. To this day, they still come out and set up a teepee and drum all night, especially flying on hallucinogenics. Turns out I was right. There was a teacher at my school that kids would claim was insanely rich, like that he lived in a giant mansion near the oceanfront and he only taught because he just genuinely loved being a teacher. He was pretty private, so he'd always say, "You shouldn't ask people about their finances," when kids would just ask him. So senior year, he has the seniors over for a year-ends award ceremony and superlatives type dinner deal. Yep. Super rich and lived in a huge mansion by the ocean. Said he inherited all his money from his parents, and I think he said he had a sibling or 2 that got written out of the will for being crappy, so he didn't have to share it. Became a teacher out of college, and then when his parents died, he inherited everything. He just kept teaching because he liked it. We had a rumor about there being a white horse in the woods behind the movie theater in our town. There were a couple of homeless people living there though, so no one went and checked them out. Well, before seeing a movie one day, me and a couple of friends decided to make the trek. We stumbled past a makeshift camp, found a small path that led to a fence. We stood there for a couple of seconds and then seemingly out of nowhere, a majestic white steed came trotting towards us. We snapped a quick pic on an early 2000s cell phone of our friend and the horse and got the heck out of there. The picture absolutely looked fake and no one believes us about it to this day. I am personally mortified that you found American Shadowfax and didn't immediately go on a quest to tame the Lord of all Horses. Although for all we know, one of those guys you assumed was a homeless person was actually a wizard. The differences between Gandalf the Grey and a homeless man are fewer than you think. It would also explain why he was there and why nobody ventured into the woods. There was an unmarked graveyard in the field across the road in rural Canada. The oldest guy in the area talked about there being one somewhere in the area, but he wasn't sure where. Maybe 10 years ago, an older gentleman, maybe in his 70s, came over to our house when I was home from college and asked who owned the property across the road. He said his family lived in the area over 100 years ago and he was looking for the family burial plot. He asked for permission to search and spent time with dowsing rods in the field, maybe 75 acres total, but he was focused closer to the road. He marked over 15 spots that he said were places where bodies were buried underground, and that he could tell by the way the rods moved if it was male, female, or a child. He even showed us how the rods would be still, but when he walked over the spots he marked, they would cross or move away from each other. He came back the next year and spent some money getting a big stone and a nice custom plaque made to mark this spot. He probably spent $1,000 or more on that, including renting a backhoe and operator. Then we never saw him again. We used to play hide-and-go-seek at night, but we'd never go to that area where he placed the markings because it felt eerie and sometimes it would be foggier. After he showed us the dowsing rods thing that one day, I told my younger cousin to lay on the ground so I could try it on him. I walked over him with the dowsing rods and nothing happened, so I said, "Well, guess you haven't got a soul," and walked back to the house. What seemingly harmless parenting habit is actually messing up your kids? Never saying sorry to them. My mum only just recently started telling me sorry when she gets worked up about something. It's built up such a resentment for her over the years, and I also have trouble saying sorry myself because of it. Tell your kids sorry, especially if you overreact to something they did. Not following through with your promises. If you told your child you were buying ice cream tomorrow in the hopes that they'd forget, and the next day when they ask you, you tell them no, they'll see you as unreliable. I taught my children at a very young age that outside of extreme circumstances, failing to keep a promise made is the same as telling a lie. Therefore, I won't make promises to them that I'm not absolutely certain I can keep. They learned early in life that I take my promises very seriously and I'll go to great lengths to honor them. We've hit very hard times recently, and I've had to delay delivery on some promises, which breaks my heart. But they know that I'll fulfill those promises eventually, and they're much more empathetic and understanding than their peers have been in similar situations. I found that when my parents teased me about stuff that I was clearly uncomfortable with, it made me tell them less later in life. I have a good relationship with my parents, but I don't tell them lots about my life because it's easier if they don't know or tease about it. Same for me. It was usually mild stuff like, "Ooh, he has a crush on a girl," or something like that, but I hated the attention and it made me uncomfortable. Later in my 20s, when I met my wife, she couldn't understand why I was so secretive. I'm pretty sure it's from that. I just stopped telling people things and still don't tell my parents everything that's going on in my life. I love them, of course, and we have a great relationship, but yeah, I'm pretty sure the teasing messed me up a bit. Once my brother was sent to his room by my dad after they got into an argument about something stupid. I used Google to prove my brother right, and we were both grounded for being disrespectful. Until he found out we were actually right, he never ungrounded us until the week was over and only told me he was wrong. Moral of the story, being right is apparently disrespectful. A seemingly harmless mistake is rewarding your child with something when they do something they already enjoy. Take, for example, reading. If a child just enjoys reading, let the child read without getting any reward. Once you start rewarding the child for that act, their intrinsic motivation gets replaced. It's called the over-justification effect. I agree with this, but I also understand that it presents a conundrum if you have multiple kids, some of whom need to be motivated more than others. Seeing others be rewarded for something that you already do better definitely stings a little when you're young and can make you lose motivation. I was a kid who loved to read, and I still do, and whenever we participated in a program that rewarded reading hours, like the library summer program where you got raffle tickets and could win stuff like baseball and museum tickets, I felt like the most glorious scammer. Joke's on you, Pizza Hut. I would have done all that reading anyway, suckers. In a different vein of thought, making finances a taboo subject. Financial illiteracy can be a devastating thing once entering adulthood. You want to keep your children from making your own money mistakes? Don't be too proud to teach them what those mistakes were. And to clarify, I don't mean robbing your children of their innocence by putting the weight of your debt on them at an early age, but rather teaching them how to properly budget their money as they earn it, how to build savings, what credit is and how to responsibly manage it, credit utilization, the danger of revolving balances, not using credit as an emergency fund, for example. You teach them about predatory interest rates and the true cost of a loan, set realistic expectations for the costs of living, stuff like that. Don't smother your kids. My mum quit having her own life the moment my brother and I were born. She was incredibly devoted and a loving mother and was very kind to us, but when we were born she stopped having friends, didn't work and was home every single night from when I was born to when I moved out in my early 20s. She was very easy to upset because she had no other source of self-esteem, and any time I screwed up, and I screwed up a lot, it was as if I had levied a very personal attack against her. In the last 5 years or so before I left, I don't think we had a single conversation that didn't drive her to tears, and I promise I wasn't that bad. I constantly felt cornered and stressed and fell into a depression as a defense mechanism, and she took my resulting lack of performance very personally, creating a very treacherous cycle that was only broken when I enlisted and finally got away. To this day, I often feel like I'm a bad person who failed to live up to her love. Not congratulating your child when they achieve something. A friend of mine never got any praise from his parents growing up. Always felt he wasn't good enough. Show the child that their hard work doesn't go unnoticed. Not creating a safe space for your kids to tell their secrets and make mistakes. When I was younger, I excitedly confided in my mum about my first boyfriend, but instead of calmly talking me through this, she immediately brought my dad into the conversation, they both yelled at me, and forced me to break up with him. If you qualify for food stamps, take the frickin' food stamps. Don't make your kid live on macaroni and cheese made with water because we don't take handouts. Pride can be such a dangerous thing. The health, safety, and well-being of your children should trump anyone's pride, in my opinion. Using them as props for jokes in public. Glad you got a kick out of it, Dad. Not stopping when your child says stop, whether it's teasing, tickling, or wrestling. Kids who have parents that don't respect their boundaries always seem to end up being the biggest jerks and bullies because they've learned they don't have to respect other people's feelings. Mocking them, laughing at them. Adults do it to each other all the time, but kids who haven't been immersed in the background cruelty of our culture for years just don't understand that it's the language of the land, and not that they themselves are particularly unworthy of respect. There was one time I was trying to help a friend at their birthday party by taking their presents to them, but all the adults and my parents thought I was being selfish and wanted them for myself, and joked and laughed at me and just ignored me explaining myself and carried on. I think that hurt my self-esteem a lot in the long run. Well, realistically, it'd be helicopter parents. You always want to look out for your kids, right? Make sure they're not doing things they're supposed to do, walk in without knocking. It ruins a relationship with a kid because even though you have a sense of privacy, the kid doesn't and will always be paranoid of anyone entering their room without warning. It ruins them. Would my mom let me do this? Is she okay with that? Is what they're always thinking. My parents were helicopter parents. I wasn't allowed to lock my bedroom door. My mom listened in on my phone calls, this was in the landline phone days, and went through my personal belongings when I wasn't home, including reading the notes that friends and I passed in school. I wasn't allowed to date. Doing this only prevents your children from learning how to form healthy relationships. You should teach your children how to do things, such as date, in a safe and responsible manner rather than ban it. Not giving them factual and straightforward health and life skills education talks. My parents answered my questions truthfully and at an age-appropriate level throughout my childhood, and I'm extremely thankful for it. Others around me have clearly not been that lucky. My parents relied on a school to teach me about the birds and the bees and have never said a word about it. Luckily, I had excellent life skills teachers who taught me everything. I'm not going to lie, I kept anxiously waiting for the moment when they were going to finally have the talk with me, but it just never happened. Getting them involved in problems they have no control over. My parents felt the need to keep me in the loop regarding our pending foreclosure and argued in front of me over which one was to blame when I was 10. What possible reason is there to share that with a kid? I barely slept for months. I was convinced the cops were going to bust in at midnight and throw us all outside. On the flip side of this, let your kids know if the family's facing an eviction. I was the only one home when the marshals came. The saddest part of this question is that my mum had done so many things that everyone is saying is bad, like not hugging, not praising, telling me to suck everything up. So let me give you one that I feel like would have helped me a lot growing up. Don't be afraid to admit when you're wrong or when you make mistakes to your child. My parents would go out of their way to justify any mistake they made and make it seem as if they were right no matter what the situation was. It gave me a pretty messed up view of right and wrong, as well as learning from mistakes, but was fixed by my grandma. That's a long story. This one seems to be a recurring answer for this particular topic. It's pretty common to think of your parents as these infallible beings for the longest time, isn't it? And purportedly not super healthy if they keep trying to force that impression after the fact. Admit your mistakes, parents. It sets a good example. Giving in to your kids' wants and desires without upholding discipline and consequences will give your kids a large uphill battle to climb later. I say this because my parents babied me a lot when I was young. I never had to do anything I didn't want to. For example, when I started getting bad grades because I wasn't doing my homework, my parents would have conferences with my teachers so they could give me extra credit. I had a rude awakening in college when I realized how hard life is. I 100% love and adore my parents, and who's to say if they did discipline me more then I'd have turned out different? Probably not, but you never know. But I know that when I have kids, I already know a few things I'll do differently. Pretty much telling you that whatever activity that you enjoy doing is annoying or dumb. I used to love singing. I was in chorus and would play my favorite songs over and over to learn the words. Not only did my sisters tease me for it, but my parents told me to shut the hell up constantly. So I stopped singing. I must have been terrible, right? I sing when I'm alone or jokingly with some friends. What really broke me was when I went to visit everyone for the holidays. My sister said that she was surprised I never pursued singing, since I seemed to love it so much when I was younger. I nearly started crying and had to bite my tongue so I wouldn't scream at her for being one of the reasons I stopped. It's always funny for the ones doing the teasing, but it actually hurts the ones being teased, especially when it's coming from people who are supposed to love you. When I was 4, my parents adopted a kitten. Of course, I'd never seen anything quite so delightful before, and I could barely keep my hands off the little furball. So, about 2 or 3 days passed, I got up in the morning and walked out and asked, "Where's the kitten?" And my parents told me that he'd died, implying that my roughhousing had killed it. I was terrified to touch an animal for several years afterwards. In fact, they'd simply given the kitten back to the people they got it from. I grew up in a very strict Asian household. My parents were very strict on the never wake us up policy. To this day, I get very anxious and refuse to wake people up, in fear of being yelled at and locked in a closet. I'm 22 years old. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below, and if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. Telling your kid they're always a winner. We love our kids and want them to feel special, but it's setting them up to be disappointed later in life when they find out not everyone can win. Let them feel the disappointments early on and teach them it's okay. They'll grow up better to handle the stresses of life. Telling them that the family members who are mean to them or neglect them actually love them. Treating crying as if it's something that only weak people do. My dad in particular used to yell at me for crying, which only made me cry more, which made him yell more and, well, you get the point. In high school, I tried to bring up the possibility of me having anxiety problems that I'd spoken to the counselor about because my friends made me go since they were worried. Dad told me I was just being a drama queen. I can't express that I'm anxious or stressed around my dad because apparently other people have it worse. Even now, I'm 21 and seeing a psychiatrist in a couple of weeks because I've just felt so bad lately and I would never let my dad know. I think I'd rather die than my dad know I've been seeing a psychiatrist and discussing the possibility of me having OCD with said psychiatrist, which does explain a lot and is actually kind of comforting for me to know, because Dad's got so mad at me for being weak lately. Being overprotective as a parent, or just not listening to your children. Oh, I have a few doozies. Thinking that whenever your kids open their mouth, they're going to lie to you. Telling your kids that they're just being dramatic whenever they're actually upset about something. And telling them they're being manipulative whenever they show their feelings, like tears. Making them give physical affection when they don't want to. If Uncle Bob makes them uncomfortable, don't make them give him a hug. If Aunt Karen freaks them out, don't make them give her a kiss. Of course, it's important they be kind, but don't teach them that the feelings of others are more important than their own bodily autonomy. If someone close to your family dies, don't say to your children, they're just sleeping. Congratulations, you just created a lifetime insomniac. My 5-year-old understands death. We don't sugarcoat it much, and death isn't taboo. When a kid understands death as a permanent condition, it makes it easier to explain the gravity of dangerous situations. Sticking through a toxic fricking relationship for the kids. It doesn't help. Part ways, be good parents, spend quality time together with the kids, but don't stay together and frickin' hate your lives under the guise of it being for the kids. We pick up on that stuff. It's a terrible example to set. Not having them do chores. My parents pushed me to be an academic, so doted on me hand and foot as a kid to make more room for study. When you're too young and stupid to know any better, you think it's a blessing. When I moved out to uni, I didn't really know how to clean, when to clean, what to clean with, how to wash clothes, how to get them to dry, stuff like that. The only thing I could do is cook and binge drink. That's no way to bring up a kid, and it's a steep learning curve doing all that stuff for the first time in your early 20s. It sounds like a super lame answer, but make sure every kid does their fair share of chores. My parents unconsciously taught me to value external validation over everything else, and it has been the cause of persistent depression in my adult life. Examples that seem innocent, like praising good grades and emphasizing academic achievement, being inordinately pleased when people said good things about me to them, encouraging me to apply for awards and scholarships and then being super proud and boastful to others about how amazing I am, tacking up newspaper articles about me, certificates and other things all over the house, writing Christmas letters that were essentially a laundry list of all my accomplishments, telling me that I could do anything I wanted or be anything I wanted, that I was exceptional. I mean, I think you get the idea, right? All of this taught me that I was only worth what I could do. It's taught me that I'm only as valuable as others deem me to be. Outwardly, I appear poised, accomplished, and successful. Inwardly, I have an exceedingly low, virtually non-existent sense of self-worth. I push myself constantly to do more and achieve more and earn more accolades. I burn out and have panic attacks. I feel numb inside. I don't know who I am or what I actually enjoy because I've been groomed to only do what others want of me. I'm almost 40 and basically completely lost. Discouraging them from asking questions. Yes, it can be annoying to keep hearing, "But why, Daddy, Mummy?" But I've met far too many adults who admit they stopped asking questions because as a kid, their parents would shut them up or be like, "There she goes asking questions again." Inquisitive minds need to be fostered. I've heard of parents instituting a 5 whys in a row limit. I have no idea if that's good parenting or not, but it does seem like at least acknowledging that a healthy amount of questioning is okay without letting it get ridiculous. That said, telling kids they aren't allowed more info after a certain amount may have its own problems. Saying, "Because I said so." Telling them they're smart. I'm not saying to not praise them for a job well done, but reinforcing that a child is smart will teach them that they don't need to try as hard to learn. Education should be a constant challenge, in the same way exercise should always be a challenge. If it's not difficult, you're not learning. Saying, "I don't care who started it." I grew up with friends whose siblings would target the one with the bad temper, provoke them into a rage, then cry and play victim when they got hit. In this case, it does matter who started it. A parent has to make it clear that violence isn't okay, but neither is provoking someone into said violence. It doesn't matter that said person never hit or kicked while their sibling did. They would never have gotten hurt in the first place if they didn't encourage the aggression to begin with. Children are clever and they'll find loopholes in their parents' rules. Parents need to be better and snuff out that kind of BS when it starts. If they don't, they'll raise a manipulator and a scapegoat. One will use them and one will resent them. It's a lose-lose, all because of a simple rule. Telling them not to cry or telling them to suck it up. That one messed me up for a while. Creating an environment where you tell your kid their feelings aren't valid just because they aren't the same as yours, or your kid processes their emotions differently than you. Angrily telling your kid that they're too sensitive or dramatic or theatrical or hormonal is just going to mess your kid up and encourage them to bottle up emotions to avoid upsetting you, and it's going to lead to major communication issues. Also, constantly pushing an intelligent or self-motivated child to work harder and harder and to do better. You're setting your kid up to be a perfectionist, which can be incredibly damaging to his or her mental health in the long run. Always assuming the oldest child is to blame for everything. Telling kids they have to finish their plate. Sometimes there's too much food for them. I was overeating for years and it took a lot of work to break the habit and shed the extra weight. Telling your daughter that if a boy is mean to you, it's because he likes you. Choosing their friends for them. Let them figure out who's bad and who's good on their own. Within reason, of course. The words, "Oh, look who finally decided to join us," when referring to you coming out of your room when guests are over. That's a way to ease your child into social anxiety. Never showing up for events. I remember my parents didn't come to most of my chorus concerts. It really sucked to see my classmates' families cheer them on while my parents were absent. I brought home one of my chorus program papers to show my parents, and I found it in the trash the next day. I was sad because I wanted to keep it, but seeing it in the trash, I didn't want it anymore. I love my parents and I don't blame them for not showing up. They were small business owners and it was hard for them to find people who could work for them whenever I had concerts or anything. It still hurt though. I thought I should add that my little sister and grandma would come to them, but my relationship with my grandma isn't great. It's just not the same as having your parents there, if that makes sense. Anytime a child is playing with a child of the opposite gender and they respond with, "Ooh, who's your boyfriend or girlfriend?" that crap completely stopped me from even speaking to girls until damn near high school. I just saw this happen in front of my eyes not too long ago. My aunt started teasing my 12-year-old cousin because she found out that a girl he was friends with had a little crush on him. Well, that friendship ended right there and then. My cousin was obviously really embarrassed. Of course, my aunt made the big announcement in front of a bunch of people. I was really mad at my aunt. Like, what the frick did she expect? Having kids before you've worked on your own psychological issues. These issues will always be part of the relationship between you and your child. You can't hide it. Become the person you want to be before having children. Yes. And if you don't have that option, work through your issues as you need to. Don't shut them out or act like everything's fine. They know when their parents are upset, but don't rely on them to be mini therapists for you. For example, just saying things like, "Mummy's feeling a bit sad today, but she's working hard to make today better." Just let them be a part of it without overburdening them with your issues. Not letting them have freedoms, such as going out with friends, making their own friends, things like that. I'm 17 and now I'm just getting actual friends outside of school for the first time. I was never allowed to do anything as a kid. I know my parents cared about me, but it's hurt me more in the long run. It's caused some serious social anxiety. I feel this. My mum was very restrictive because she didn't want me to make the same mistakes she did growing up, like substance use, staying out late, and skipping school. But she never explained to me about responsibility, safety, or things like that. It was just, because I said so, because it's my house. It backfired on her as I became rebellious and wound up with a severe substance use problem that I'm only just now managing, and dropping out of high school 3 months before I would have graduated. Hovering over your child. I don't just mean helicopter parenting, which is even more serious. I just mean doing things like demeaning their chores, trying to steer them down a certain career path, putting them in programs or sports they don't like, stuff like that. Constant remarks about the child's body, like telling them they need to lose or gain weight or making any comment about their body type. It goes for everyone in the family. Don't do that, unless you want your child to develop an eating disorder later on in life. Yelling at them. My mother yelled at me constantly growing up, and I ended up learning some really insidious, subtle life lessons and struggling with anxiety because of it. What was the most cursed thing that went down in a locker or bathroom? I was coming back from a road trip and we were driving for 3 hours non-stop. At this point, I really needed to pee, but we couldn't find a place to stop at. After another hour, I was very desperate and felt like my bladder was going to explode, so luckily we found a gas station with a bathroom. I was running to the bathroom, the only one there was, when I saw 2 little girls giggling and running away from there. Long story short, there was number 2 all over the walls, sink, floor, everywhere. I mean, I couldn't hold it anymore, so I just closed my eyes, did my best squat, went to my car, and tried to pretend that had never happened. My mum once got caught in the clean cycle of a self-cleaning public restroom. For those who've never heard of such things, it's a completely sealed unit. You pay to get in, do your business, and when you exit, the door locks, and the whole stall is just automatically cleaning with this high-pressure water system. Some random girl once saved my butt as I was trying to sneak in after her without paying. Basically, she had paid, was done, and coming out of the stall, she stopped me as I held the door trying to enter and said, "I wouldn't do that if I were you, the whole thing is flushing." I closed the door and you can hear the stall being pressure hosed down from the outside. Damn, I owe that girl some karma. I ran a venue that sometimes held raves back in the late 90s. My girlfriend came to one with her best friend and I let them in for free. At some point in the night, someone came up and told me people were doing the deed in the men's room. My assistant manager and I went in. He thought he was hilarious and kicked open the stall and yelled, "You cannot do that in here." There was my girlfriend's best friend trying to give a down-under kiss to a guy who couldn't get it up because of the substances they were taking or whatever. She was clearly also on something and was kneeling in an inch of disgusting water because the toilet had backed up and overflowed. I was taking a dump in a one-person bathroom outside a gas station, and as I was pulling my pants up, a mum and her daughter walked in. They had to have seen my eggplant. They screamed and closed the door. I washed my hands and nervously walked out and they were gone. They just left the scene. And yeah, I've been wondering why I didn't lock the door, and I've just remembered right now. I didn't know you had to get the key from the register, so while the door was open a little, I walked in and just did my thing. I guess Mum grabbed the key from the cashier like you're supposed to, and unlocked the locked door. And when I say they had to have seen my Johnson, it was because I was in the perfect angle for them to see everything. Not that they had to see it because it was a sight to see. Quite the opposite. The narrator is ultra paranoid about locking the door at all times. However, life seems to compensate for this by making him the person who walks in on life's less paranoid people in situations like the one we just mentioned. I honestly don't know which one's worse, because it's not like the shame and sourceless guilt of seeing people at their least ideal moment isn't excruciating either. I was at a track meet last week and just ate a huge lunch after a race, so I needed to take a massive dump. I waddled into a stall and plopped myself down on the toilet seat. I then proceeded to push out the most gut-wrenching log of my life. As I finished wiping and got up, I realized that a line had built up outside the stalls. I flushed the toilet and it doesn't go down. The water level doesn't go down either. I then proceed to go on a walk of shame out of the stall as about 10 other dudes saw my impressive mound slowly rise out of the toilet bowl and overflow onto the ground, seeping its way to the low corner of the bathroom. Next time you should establish dominance by staring directly into the eyes of every man waiting in line. I did this. I am the danger. And they'll respect you more. I walked into a locker room to see an undressed fellow standing in the shower area, there was no water running by the way, covered head to toe in soap suds so thick that it might have been shaving cream. The only thing not covered was his eyes. It was surprisingly creepy. At the gym, they have community towels for wiping the seats of the machines. Just grab a towel and do your thing. At the end of your workout, throw it in the towel bin. I sweat. I mean wet t-shirt contest looking type sweat. So not only do I wipe the machines thoroughly when I'm done, I also have to keep wiping the sweat from my brow. When I'd finished my workout, I went to the locker room to change. Setting my towel, my phone, and my earbuds on the bench, I opened my locker, took out my bag, and began to change. There were other guys in there in close proximity, so I just kept my eyes forward and went about my business. Still sweating, after putting on my clean shirt, I grabbed my sweat towel off the bench and wiped my face. Then I started putting my gym stuff into my bag, looked at the bench, and saw my phone and earbuds. They were still sitting on my sweat towel, the towel I'd used during my workout. Slowly, I looked down at my hand, at the other towel I'd just wiped my face with. It wasn't my one, and it was so wet. About 10 years ago, me and some friends were driving back from the lake. I had to go number 2 real bad, so I asked the driver to pull over at the next exit. All I had on was flip-flops and swimming trunks. My one buddy, being a monster, ran past me to take the stall, and I was left to wait for him in this old-style restroom. Next, this old man busted through the door, pants around his ankles, shuffling his feet, holding his member. He was projectile blasting streams of diarrhea all over behind him. He shuffled past me, pushing on the stall door, which my buddy had locked. I was pressed up against the wall, scared to death of the horror that I was witnessing. The old man looked around, spotted one of those long urinals that go all the way to the floor, and made a spin for it. He turned his body to head to the urinal and spray-painted an enormous load of diarrhea across my legs and feet. I screamed out in terror like I'd just been fatally wounded. The old man bent over the urinal, pumping loads against the back of it as it splattered everywhere. He just looked at me with these dead eyes and said, "God damn diarrhea." I will never forget that day for however long that I live. I once had a parent-teacher conference in the Buck. I was the teacher. I'd been at the gym and finally decided I could just change and not duck into one of those tiny rooms. Standing in my undies when I heard, "Mrs. Melser? Oh, you teach my son." Yep, sure do. My principal allowed me to count that bathroom consultation towards my conference hours, so there is that silver lining. I was on the way home from my friend's house and things just started to get worse. I needed to crap so badly that I immediately went to the nearest public restroom. Upon arriving, only one cubicle was available because the other 2 are out of service. I also find it strange that there are no urinals inside this bathroom. But anyway, after doing my business, I just realized that the flush wasn't working and there was an empty pail besides me. I was about to get water on the drum at the corner of the bathroom when 3 or 4 girls went inside the bathroom. I was still inside the cubicle and I know that they're going to use this loo, so since only one cubicle is available, they're just waiting for me to finish. When I got out, they started screaming and asking what I'm doing inside the girls' bathroom. One of them saw my pile of number 2 and told her friends about it. Then they looked at me with disgust and left the bathroom immediately. I'm a guy, by the way, if that wasn't obvious. Some years ago, La Havana Social Club had an album of traditional Cuban songs popular across Europe, and I decided to visit Cuba. While traveling across the island, I heard that they'd be playing live in Havana the following weekend and decided to hang around to see them, only for Fidel Castro to decide to address the country on that very same Saturday night, effectively cancelling everything. We turned up at the venue, but everything was shut up and there was no one about. 2 weeks later, I was in a lovely town called Trinidad and find out to my delight that they'll be performing there in Trinidad that very night. And not only that, they're practicing right at the moment in a charming garden bar very nearby. We head straight there, and it was all I could have hoped for. Beautiful walled garden, small bar with some services, a single toilet, and a group of skilled elderly Cubans doing what they do best. There were very few other people there. The music was so familiar, it was an amazing thing to see. So close, so personal. And then during the third or fourth song, it happened. You may have experienced this before. You know, when you have to go, like right now. Great. The toilet is there, right next to where they're playing. A very rustic toilet with a door, like many things in Cuba, that doesn't quite fit right. And I was loud. I was really loud. The music stopped. I left straight after that, avoiding any eye contact. Honestly, I think stopping a concert with the sheer concussive sound of your bowel movements is as much of an achievement as anything else. Even if they didn't want to thank you, I think you deserve recognition for the strength of your mega dump. Well done there, sir, or madam. I'd gone to eat with my wife at an Indian restaurant, and then we met up with co-workers at a bar afterwards. The colonic bullet train that often follows Indian food just hit me. I didn't want to crap in the bar bathroom, so I ran down to the gas station on the corner. I know, it's still gross, but in my experience, anything is better than the bathroom at a bar. But then it turned out the gas station's bathroom was closed. I had no time left and ran back to the bar and into the bathroom. I now realize that 1, the bathroom door didn't lock, and 2, the oddest arrangement for a restroom I'd ever seen was before me. As soon as you open the door, there was no toilet with no stall, followed by the sink, then 2 urinals. I was mortified, but at this point, it's happening. As I sat there, blowing out Indian food, a steady stream of patrons wandered in and out. Every time the door opened, I could see the entire bar. When they washed their hands, we were intimately close, and it was nearly impossible not to make eye contact as I struggled to end this nightmare of face-contorting colon cramps. Eventually, my buddy Brian swung the door open, sees me, and does an about-face while cackling hysterically. I don't know if you've ever tried to wipe your butt while in close contact with strangers, but let me tell ya, it's humiliating. I finally think I'm done with this nightmare and wandered out to my table of co-workers who were all laughing hysterically and clapping. One of my bosses nods to the DJ that announces, "The shameless pooper has now concluded his evil reign over the men's room." And he spins up "Doin' That Butt" by EU. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below. And if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. I went number 2 at the cricket, and there was surprisingly no toilet paper. It was before the start of the first women's game of the season, so unsurprisingly, I was alone in the toilet. I had no issues. I had to then wait until the next person came in. After sitting there for about a minute, contemplating whether or not I could use my old cardigan and dump it, a 12-year-old girl came in who passed me under a very decent amount of toilet paper. I said thank you to the girl, but also sung her praises to her mum waiting outside. I was so relieved. In elementary school, we never used the last stall because it was haunted. A junkie shadow boxing in the mirror after he tried to flush his pants down the toilet. I feel very sorry for the poor schmuck that had to clean that up. When I was in middle school, our female gym teacher was relatively masculine and was rumored to be batting for the other team. She was also not a very nice person, probably because she had no choice but to be tough. Anyway, being a middle school and mid-2000s, LGBT issues and people were still considered extremely taboo. A cruel rumor started that she had a camera in the locker room to record all of the girls changing. I thought it was super mean and chose not to perpetuate it. I didn't believe it until I saw it after basketball practice one night. There was a tiny webcam on top of one of the far lockers, pointed out across the whole locker room. It had a blinking red light. My blood ran cold. At this point, I should have checked it out or gone to another teacher, but I was 12 and instead decided to ramp up the rumor more and tell all of my friends what I'd seen. The next time I was in the locker room, the webcam was gone. The gym teacher also confronted me about spreading hurtful rumors and asked from where I'd heard it. She effectively managed to shut it down before it reached school administration and nothing ever came of it. It always bothered me because if she was guilty, I tipped her off by spreading gossip, and if she was innocent, I was a huge jerk that perpetuated a homophobic rumor. At this point, I don't know which narrative is accurate. The whole thing just makes me feel bad. Actually, here's one. I was in line at a festival to go to the Portaloo, and there was someone holding up the toilet for a good 15 minutes. Everyone in the line started getting annoyed and ranty until one chick ran up and ripped the door open. There were 2 girls wearing overalls pulled down around their middle, with their fronts hanging out, and they started to yell at everyone while rubbing their noses. They yelled something about having to take a dump, changing sanitary pads, and having a chunder, but me thinks it might have had more to do with the white snow up their butts and noses. I had to go to a meeting across the state. It was a long drive and I'd had a lot of coffee. So I went into the restroom about 30 minutes into the meeting when I thought no one would be in there to have what we in the caffeine addiction business call a rear-end disaster. So I went into the stall and just started going ham. In the words of Danny DeVito, so anyway, I started blasting. You all know what that's about. After the London Blitz was over, I was fumbling around for toilet paper in a half squat, looking less human and more ape than normal, just messing with the TP dispenser because all of the paper was jammed up inside it at a weird angle. I got out and started doing damage control on my butthole when this lady just frickin' burst into my stall. The lock was kind of screwy but absolutely engaged, and I had a purse on the floor as a backup signal to passers-by, but this dolt just frickin' slammed into my stall. She saw my whole situation. I didn't even feel like a human. I felt like a toilet paper monster. There was crap on my butt cheeks, and this lady stumbles in like a gazelle, happening upon two lions making gross, disgusting lion love. But does she leave, like a sensible person? Does she say, "Oops, my bad for ripping that lock apart and ignoring the several other unoccupied and obviously open stalls and going directly for the closed-looking one with the noises emanating from it like the gosh damn bombs over London"? No. She looks me dead in the eye and says, "Why didn't you lock the door?" and just waits for an explanation. Like, lady, no. Go away. Now I was the gazelle and she was the frickin' lion. I just took the hand not covered in crappy TP and started slamming the door until she got the hint. I also clogged that toilet, but I plunged it, so no hard feelings. The worst part of all this? I'm technically her boss. Maybe she was desperate too. Maybe she was trying to avoid a similar blitz in her pants and that's why she charged into your stall door like it was the wall and she was the Kool-Aid man. Awkward in any case. I don't understand what had happened to make your butt such a disaster zone, but you do have my sympathy. This is my near-miss story. I had some hot wings, the kind that you need to sign a waiver for, with my cousin just before a dinner with my girlfriend and various members of my family at my brother's father-in-law's house in the rich part of Vancouver. We both managed to finish the wings, but my cousin couldn't hold them down, and 10 minutes later, everything was back up. Not to brag, but I was victorious. Fast forward a couple of hours, I can't eat at dinner and my stomach is feeling awful. I go back to the very fancy bathroom and just chuck up. Nuclear hot sauce is not the nicest thing going in, but coming back out at body temperature and mixed with stomach acid makes it particularly vile and creates a feedback loop that makes me want to throw up more. Eventually, it finishes, I clean up and head back out to the rest of the family. After another hour or so, my girlfriend, uncle, and I go for a walk. About 10 minutes in, I instantly, and I quite literally mean instantly, have to go to the toilet. My gut decides to do a backflip and I had to stop on the spot to close my sphincter. My girlfriend and uncle found this weird and I had to explain the situation. I sent my girlfriend on a scouting mission to find the nearest toilet. Fortunately, half a block away, there's a bar, so in between waves of oncoming craps, I shuffle towards the bar. I get to the toilet and there's just one cubicle currently occupied. I was desperate. I know that soon I won't be able to hold it in, so I have a great idea. I'll go to the women's. I leave the men's and opposite is the women's. It's locked, turns out it's my girlfriend in there. I go back to the men's, I wait 10 seconds. It's coming, there's no way I'm going to be able to hold it much longer. I look at the urinal. It's my only option, otherwise I'm going right here in my pants. I rush to unbuckle my belt and then by some kind of miracle from the gods, I hear a flush. I get a rush of adrenaline that gives me the power to close my butt in time to rush past the man exiting the cubicle. He says something to me, but at this point I couldn't care less and just apologize. I sit down and release. It was glorious. Purely magical. I can't tell you how happy I was to not crap myself. There was loads of splashback, but I could deal with that. It was over in seconds. I look at the toilet roll holder and to my dismay, there was nothing. Turns out the guy had told me that there was no toilet paper. However, it seems like the gods weren't quite done with me yet. I hear the door open to the toilet and I can see shoes coming towards the cubicle. It was the guy who'd just finished with a roll of toilet paper in his hand. He passed it under the door and told me he thought I needed it. The Canadians are just so damn friendly. I don't know if school restrooms technically count as public restrooms, but nevertheless. The year was 2001. I was in year 2 at school, and my younger brother had just started kindergarten. Whenever the bells would chime to signify the end of recess, there'd always be a bathroom rush, while everyone relieved themselves before heading to class. One particular recess, I'm standing shoulder to shoulder with a bunch of other kids, taking a leak into the urinal. Without warning, I feel a solid shove between my shoulder blades, and try as I might to delay the inevitable, I topple into the little gutter area of the trough. Many of the kids tried to avert their streams, but it was too late. I was soaked from falling in and then some from above. And as I looked back up, shielding my eyes from the burning rain, who should I see but my younger brother looking down at me? I might have been covered in unspeakable fluid, but I assure you, he was the one with the crap-eating grin. For whatever reason, he just thought it would be funny to shove me in the urinal. The joke was on him though, because my teachers quickly decided that I'd had enough for one day and called our mum to go pick me up. My brother didn't understand why I got to go home early and he didn't. I can still picture the look on his face as I waved at him through the window as the car drove away and the teachers were scolding him. First night staying at my girlfriend's house and I got bad diarrhea. After spending 20 minutes filling the bowl with liquid chocolate, I went to flush and to my horror the toilet blocks. For some reason, the bathroom had no plunger, toilet brush, or anything I could use to remedy the situation. After panicking a few minutes, I noticed the smell was getting bad in the bathroom, and to save embarrassment in front of my girlfriend's family who I'd just met, I had to clear up the toilet ASAP. I made a split-second decision to shove my arm down the loo and clean the pipe by hand. I didn't quite register what I'd done until I was scraping my toilet paper and crap from out of the pipes. God must have smiled upon me because the next flush worked perfectly. Although the toilet was clear, my conscience was not. I've got to live with that forever. In the store where I work, there are 5 stalls. One is handicap accessible and 2 leak at the back so that when you sit down, you just have this constant drip on your lower back. The other 2 were in use, so, knowing that no handicapped people work there, I used the handicapped one. Of course, this is the day that a really higher-up supervisor in a wheelchair that normally works in the office 4 miles away had a meeting and needed to use the bathroom after said meeting. I'd only seen this guy once a couple of years earlier when I started this job. I leave, head sunken apologetically, and he just gives me this knowing look. Not mean or upset, just knowing. It still keeps me up some nights. Not horror, but weird. In military basic training, there are no doors on stalls. Pretty shocking for 100 new guys who lived at home the day before. We all had to go at the same time and stood in line waiting for the next guy to get off the pot. Well, turns out about 2 out of the 100 guys on my team wipe from back to front. They actually stand up after taking a dump and then wipe their butts from back to front by reaching between their legs. Those 2 caught so much crap in the form of laughter and ridicule from the 98% that wipe the normal way. They soon changed their ways. By now, I know some of you guys are out there wiping from back to front. It's 2% of you from my experience. You're doing it wrong, in case no one ever told you before now. Went out to eat at a place about 20 minutes from our house. On the way home, things started to not feel so good. I was gonna crap myself, and I was still 10 minutes from my place. There's some new home construction, and I see a porta potty at one of the home sites, so I flew around the corner, screeched to a halt and jumped in. That's when my frickin' zipper in my pants sticks, and I unleash so much bad calamari diarrhea that it's literally flowing out from the bottom of my pants. I text my wife, who was in the car, that I didn't make it, and she drives the 20-minute round trip to our house to get me some clothes, while I stand in a 100-degree crap house, surrounded by a mess of my own making. Ladies and gentlemen of the night, what was your first day of work like? I started working because I'd gotten a few propositions through a dating website. I was studying med at the time and I was short on money. So one time this guy made me what seemed like a lucrative offer and I agreed. I didn't know how any of it worked, so I told a friend I was going out and to call or text me in an hour's time. We initially met in a park at night, sat in his very, very nice car and had a bit of a flirty chat, then made an appointment. He said he was 58 years old, but I think he was about 15 to 20 years older than that. A week or 2 later, I drove over to his apartment. I was petrified, but I needed the money, so I rang the doorbell. It was a lovely apartment, and he paid up front. He was nice enough. He asked me to do some things that I didn't want to do, so I said, maybe not this time. Kept an eye on the time via the helpful clock radio next to the bed, and thankfully he finished on time. Had a shower, bit of a chat afterwards, and then he kissed me goodbye on the cheek. I think the fact that I said no to one particular act annoyed him a little bit, but he texted later and asked if I'd like to do it again, and with another working girl in the mix. Things proceeded from there. Not sure if this is what you're looking for. I was a different kind of worker, a pro-dom. I'd been selling used undies for the money and thought I'd take it a step further. I decided to find a small private dungeon to rent by the hour and put up an ad online. Being new on the market, I got plenty of inquiries. Other than the first session, I loved the job for so many surprising reasons. I learned so much about how people work and often about myself. But my first pro session was terrible. He was a good client, however, anything that could have gone wrong, went wrong. including cracking his rib during a trample session, which is very rare when everything's done correctly. However, I'd never had an issue after that first one and ended up with quite a few wonderful regular clients. For many clients, they'd lived their whole lives keeping their tastes a secret. When first-timers came up to me, I was sometimes the only person they'd ever talked to about this part of their life that they often despised. I was honored to be the person who helped some of these people come to terms with their desires, and often felt more like a counselor than someone working in my particular profession. Never before had I realized how much stigmas can change and ruin a person's life. I'm so much more aware now of the comments I make because you never know what friend or loved one is secretly getting hurt by your words. The narrator can tell that this is going to be one of those videos where he learns a lot about a section of society that he'd normally never even think about or get the chance to talk to. This last story alone was very enlightening, so thanks for writing in. I drank a heap of wine before I went to the agency. This was about 2.5 years ago when the industry was booming. I did booking after booking and went home with a massive wad of cash. I didn't think about it too much, I just loved the rush of being booked and making so much money. The industry is dead over here now and I really have no idea why. I was an independent worker of the night for 4 years. My first night, I was ridiculously nervous. I went to an upscale hotel, nervously walked through the lobby, hoping I looked like I belonged there and not like what I was really there for. I was nervous the whole elevator ride up to his room. I walked to his room, lightly knocked on the door. He opened the door. For the story's sake, we'll use the name Sarah, and said, "Hi, Sarah?" And like an idiot, I replied with my real name. We laughed it off. It was quick, 10 minutes. He was polite and clean, in the area for business. I ended up seeing him a few more times over the years. It was always very nice. He tipped on top of the hourly rate, which was always appreciated and made me choose to see him over other clients in the future. Most of these guys were family men, bored with their bedroom lives at home and looking for something different. I also saw some guys that were in their 20s and I think just did it for the sake of saying someday that they did it. I also saw quite a lot of weirdos, had to kick some people out of my house, or in one case ran out the door while putting my shirt on, and a good friend of mine who was working with me ran out behind me and dove into the car through a window, just trying to leave that guy's house as quickly as possible. I'm an actively working girl. My first time was only about a month ago. It was through a website where you make offers to pay a girl to go on a date with you. They had to be very clear that it wasn't a working girl website, the stipulations on the website being that you compensated for time. It went over this many times, but the doing of bedroom activities was fairly well implied. My first time was with a 43-year-old married man in town on business. He'd contacted me about a week prior through the website, offering $80 for a date. He said he'd give me $2,000 a month for regular fun if we liked each other. I said yes, and he told me which hotel to meet him at and when. He also told me what to wear. I arrived and he wasn't too bad looking, slender and way more tan than you normally see as far north as I live. He bought me a drink first at the hotel bar and we talked for a bit. I was unbelievably nervous, but he was fairly reassuring. I was sure everyone knew what I was there for and I was terrified of anyone calling me out. Eventually, he suggested we head up to his room and I gave the meekest, "Okay," that's ever passed my lips. We went up and sat on the bed and chatted a bit more before he kissed me. After a couple of seconds, he pulled back and said, "I like the way you do that. Let's take off your clothes and see what else you do well." I got undressed and gave him a down-under kiss. I wasn't really expecting him to finish that way, but he did. After he laid back on the bed and indicated that I should join him, we snuggled and talked for a bit more. Eventually, he told me that he thought I was funny and sweet and too good for that, and that he didn't want to see me again in case he formed an emotional attachment. He said he just wanted physical fulfillment, he didn't want to mess things up with his wife. I said that was fine and we talked some more. Eventually, I started putting my clothes back on. I was waiting for him to give me some money, but he wasn't making any moves in that direction, so I sat and talked with him a bit longer. Eventually, I reminded him that we agreed on $80 for the date, and he acted all surprised. Then he made a show of looking for his wallet and then counted out each bill and dropped it on the bed as he did. I took it and left, not accepting his offer to call me a cab. I felt pretty gross. My later experiences were better. Pretty sure the guy was baiting and switching, but offering $80 with the promise of $2,000 per month to lure people in. Then during the first date, he always says he has a change of heart. He did try to meet up again, but said he didn't want to pay for that. I don't know exactly what he was thinking with that, but I pretty much told him to F off. I don't remember much about the entire 6 or so years I was in the business. The whole reason I got into working as a call girl was because I have a traumatic brain injury that causes memory loss and dissociative episodes, and I wasn't receiving treatment for it at the time. Every day, all my life up until recently, has been a struggle to appear normal. There's only one job where you're only required to appear normal for 1 or 2 hours a day, and that's an escort service. Also, I grew up in a cult. My first job was a private client, and I was totally calm on my way there, and during, it wasn't until after I got into a cab to go home that I started crying. I wasn't even upset, it was just involuntary. A month later, I joined an agency. My first night they gave me this guy who became my first regular. He always booked half an hour, and I never stayed longer than 10 minutes. The other job of the night was in an office in an old industrial estate. 2 very married men and 1 other escort. She was really nice and reassuring, and helped me get over the initial embarrassment. The rest of the night was just sitting in the car with my driver, talking about World War II and listening to Frank Sinatra. Most of the time I even had fun, but I still always get butterflies on the drive there. I think it was the anticipation of not knowing who the guy was. They could be sincerely nice or they could be a complete jerk. A few people have been asking about my education. I'm a med student in one of the more expensive parts of London. UK student loans are based on household earnings. My family are quite wealthy, and I have a few pre-existing debts. That's why I needed to do this job. This is another somewhat enlightening angle that I might not have considered otherwise. On the whole, I think the UK system of student loans is one of the better options where it isn't free like in most parts of Europe, but people having this be something that people turn to as a result of the student loan system is a pretty damning indictment. Then again, I'm sure some people do it because it's fewer hours and more pay than some hospitality or other student jobs. So maybe there's an element of preference here too. This sounds awful, but I was so desperate for money that I posted on Craigslist. Obviously, that was stupid and dangerous, but I was 17 and I didn't think about that. I basically asked people to bid to see who I'd go with. Keep in mind, this was a suburb in the Midwestern US, so the money wasn't crazy. I ended up driving 45 minutes to meet a guy who then drove me to his house. Again, so stupid. I can't believe I didn't die that night. This guy was like 50, a heavy cigarette smoker, smelled like booze. I told him I was 19. Again, stupid. He paid me $60 an hour for 3 hours. He smoked a few bowls, talked about jazz, and then very creepily went on and on about my chest. I was impressed he could get things going down there with how much substances he was taking, and with how much of a frequent user he seemed to be in general. Maybe he was on something else. That's mostly what I was thinking about the whole time. I didn't feel it when he was done because I was too concerned trying to give a good performance. So awkward, but he didn't seem to notice. When I got off him, it seemed like he had shed his protection, and I freaked out until I realized it was still inside me. We hung out for a little while, he slept and I tried not to puke, and then he took me back to my car, filled up my tank and gave me $300. All in all, not a horrible first experience, but also not wonderful. He's called me a few times, but I never went back. Just after high school, my girlfriend got a job at a service. It was back when pages were cool, for reference. I dropped her off at work on her first night. The place was in a strip mall, just a little spot that looked like a half-empty travel agency or an insurance shop. It was out calls only, so you basically wouldn't know it was that sort of place. I hung out in town because she said she'd page me if she needed me to come get her. She paged me pretty quick. I picked her up and we drove to McDonald's and got coffee. She was a wreck. She said that she'd told them she was going on a break, but that she wanted me to take her home. She wasn't even going back to get paid. She went on an out call to a guy's house. They had bouncer-like guys to drive the girls places, and so a guy drove her to some guy's house and waited outside in the car. The customer obviously wanted to do the deed, and she was totally blindsided by that. I honestly don't think she knew she was that sort of worker. She thought she was going to be a go out on the town for a date kind of deal. She even wore one of her nicest dresses. Long story short, she ended up just watching the guy tickle his pickle before fleeing the place and getting driven back to the office. Then I picked her up and she never went back. The thing I remember most clearly was when she was describing it to me. She was disillusioned, incredulous. There were pictures of his wife on the walls, pictures of his family. She was a great girl. Years on, from what I know via Facebook, she went to university, traveled the world, has a beautiful family and a successful career. A happy ending, if you will. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below. And if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. I tried being a rent boy for about a week. The first time was when someone messaged me on Manhunt offering to go south of the border on me for $200, which sounded okay and is actually not too uncommon in the gay community. I went to some random hotel in Chelsea and New York City, and yeah, we did as we arranged. It wasn't too bad until the last person I ended up seeing, which creeped me out enough to end that career. I wasn't too grossed out much by anyone, but I had a hard time keeping myself going with that guy. So for this client, with the username Glowbed, I took a little blue pill right before getting there. After about half an hour of somewhat awkward conversation, he kept talking about his night in heaven, he took me up to his room. As soon as we got there, I started to get creeped out. He lived completely alone in a large apartment, but when we got to his bedroom door, the door had a large 4x4-inch expensive keypad lock with a number password. Why would someone need that on a bedroom where they bring rent boys in when they live completely alone? The next thing he did was shut the lights off and say, "Wanna know why they call me Glowbed?" and flipped a switch which turned on bright blue lights underneath his bed. I decided to just jet out of the apartment and take a subway home. No longer an escort, I only saw a few clients and decided I'd rather make money the normal way. But here's my first experience. Signed up to an escort and camgirl site. My partner couldn't accompany me to the meet, so I got my gay best friend to drive me. It was in a travel lodge. Classy, right? And I was super nervous. I'd asked him if there was anything in particular he wanted me to wear, and he said he wanted me in casual clothes and no makeup. Of course, guys don't really have a clue what girls look like without a stitch of makeup on, so I put on foundation, blush, and mascara, and a cute sundress. The guy was around 50, I was 20 at the time, and he mainly wanted to make out and cuddle. For some reason, he had covered himself in talcum powder, which was odd, and he wasn't attractive, which made it hard for me to get going properly, but he seemed happy. The thing that weirded me out a little was he kept talking about our age differences and asked for my real name several times. I had a fake name for obvious reasons. I was reluctant to give him my real name and instead just gave him another fake name. I told him my real name was Elizabeth, but my friends called me Lizzie, and he called me Lizzie for the remainder of that appointment. Then he had the cheek to try and haggle me down for an extra hour, which I declined. Afterwards, when I was 300 quid richer for an hour of work, I felt strangely empowered. That last bit is indeed something the narrator has heard before. I guess if this kind of thing is done correctly and safely, it can be a fulfilling job for some, at least for a small part of their lives. Or maybe there are people who do it for decades and never lose that sense of power. I couldn't say. My first time was like that feeling you get as a kid when you know you weren't supposed to be doing something, but you did it anyway. It was a scary thrill, which is actually why I believe most people do it. I was 22 and had just graduated with a Bachelor of Arts in a major that would make me no money. I'd moved in with my parents and was just on a downward spiral. I posted on Craigslist, $400 an hour. I had no clue about rates and still don't, but from this thread it seems high. I met a man the next night at his house for an agreed upon 30 minutes. We sat on the couch and talked a little bit. He ran a small business, divorced, overweight, 40s. Really ordinary and quite nice actually. He took me into the bedroom and there were lit candles and a bottle of lubricant on the nightstand. I wouldn't kiss him for a while, but he seemed lonely, I guess. I eventually did, which was probably stupid. He put a Johnny on and I went south on him for a while, but he didn't keep things going consistently. I climbed on and rode him and he didn't get done by the time the 30 minutes were up. I liked him, so I kept going until he was done. Maybe another 20 minutes. I didn't charge him for the extra. I didn't enjoy it as much as I would with a regular partner, but it wasn't bad. After we finished, he thanked me and we hugged. He suggested the next time he make a spaghetti dinner and we could eat and get to know each other. It wasn't as bad as I'd expected and I wasn't mentally scarred, but I never did it again. I'm not sure why. He texted me several times after and eventually I told him I'd moved. Sorry for the stilted way of writing this, I've never told this to anyone before and it was kind of strange typing it all out. When I wasn't quite 20, I was tight on cash and decided, screw it, I needed a sugar daddy. I went on Craigslist and I found a guy. He wanted to meet me first and needed a new girl to replace his old one. He was willing to pay 4 figures per date. I drove to meet him and was stuck in traffic on the way for an hour or two. I sat at a Starbucks for a while waiting. He got lost because he was only there on a business trip. I was shaking by the time he came. We got burgers and drinks and sat at a table waiting for everything, talking. He was sweet, but not my type. I was so nervous and shaking. We got to this hotel and sat and talked and ate, then started getting frisky. He wouldn't stop talking about how amazing I looked and was, and I know he was trying to flatter me, but after a while it got really old. I stayed the night and left in the morning. He gave me money for gas. I later told him I was sorry but the age difference felt too weird and he'd have to find another girl. But really, I just couldn't stand him. Then I found this married guy. We talked, I sent him pictures of myself and he was hooked. He ordered things off Amazon for me to bring, and yeah, we're talking about bedroom equipment stuff. Doing it in the rear was on the list of necessities to him. I was a virgin that way and really hesitant about it. I told him I wanted to be blindfolded for the thrill of it, but really, I just didn't want to see his face. Drove an hour to a motel in his town to see him. The way everyone looked at me, I knew they knew what I was there for. I knocked on the door, it opened. I stepped inside where the lights were off and kept my eyes on the ground. He came up to me and started stroking my arms, my face. He instructed me to put the blindfold on, and I did. I hated it. I hated every minute of it. Doing it that way sucked, and doing it with him sucked even more. He kissed me with his bushy beard tickling my face, and I frickin' hated it. I wanted to vomit. He gave me the $400 and I left. I regretted everything. Turns out he was nuts about me. He wanted to take me on trips and buy me an apartment in his town and all that stuff. I agreed to meet him again, but not doing it in the butt and no kissing. I told him it felt weird to kiss him when he had a wife. I know that's a weird frickin' thing for a working girl to say, but what was I supposed to say? You disgust me? The second time he was on white snow and had a hard time keeping things working down there. I had to awkwardly console him while he beat himself up over it and tried to restart him several times. We laid together for a while, and while we tried a few times, without a full rager, it's pretty much a fail. Once he gave up on the whole thing and admitted defeat, I packed everything up and sat on the edge of the bed. He bought my money and placed it in my hand and told me to look at him. I was still wearing the blindfold and I shook my head. He took it off me and told me to look at him. He was wearing a bandana that covered most of his face except his eyes. He had lovely eyes, and it made me want to cry when I thought of his wife. The guy was convinced that I wasn't in it for the money. I had a sick mind, a dirty side, and only he could fulfill it. I didn't bother correcting him because I didn't want to kill the self-esteem he was building back for himself. I told him I couldn't do it anymore. He messaged me a few times over the next year, but I kept telling him no matter what price he gave me. I regret both encounters to this day, and nobody knows about it. Gay man here. I remember the first time I accepted money for doing the deed with this guy. He messaged me on a gay dating site. This guy, 60-something years old, offered me $100 to give me a down-under kiss. I knew I was down immediately. I countered back that I'd do it for $150, and he had to let me watch adult films while he did it. He asked, "Can I swallow it?" Yeah, dude. So I went to his place. As a 28-year-old adult now, I think, what the frick, that guy could have been anyone. He could have taken me prisoner and now be wearing my skin like a dress. But he didn't do any of those things. He put on some adult films for me, which was very helpful as I wasn't attracted to him at all. I whipped it out, started tickling it, and once I was ready, he went to town until I was done. $150, thank you very much. He asked if I'd be willing to come again sometime. Yeah, duh. So I'd head over to his place about once a month. Got paid, repeat. When I moved away for college, I found some similar guys. Old men, fat men, especially ugly men. I never had to make them finish, they just wanted to do it for me. So that's what I sold them. A chance to make a hot young guy with a big eggplant arrive. Forgive the vulgarity. It was all about letting these guys dream that they'd gotten me without paying for me. I learned quickly that they were happier if I could make them feel like it wasn't an exchange. My favorite and fondest memory was one guy who didn't even want that. He wanted someone to cuddle with, rub against. We stayed in our undies. I actually felt sort of good about visiting him, because it didn't feel as gross. He just wanted human contact. And I gave it to him. For a price, but I gave it to him. Male escort here. First client was a 19-year-old, thin, yet very busty blonde white girl with braces. She wanted to experiment and get some practice on someone, so she gave me $100 and did everything imaginable to me. Kind of a win. And yeah, no, 8 times out of 10 as a male escort, you get men for clients. I've never known a purely straight male worker that, even if they accepted every job they were offered, made enough money to live on. A few times here and there for extra spending money, sure, but they never made enough money to pay the bills consistently. What are some of the worst things to happen to Chuck E. Cheese workers? Had a complaint that a kid was dipping toilet paper into the women's stalls and then eating it. And yep, he was. Same kid attacked me mercilessly while I was wearing the Rat in the Hat suit, all the time screaming, "Man in suit!" The best one was a complaint about the same kid eating from other families' tables. He was, and he looked them dead in the eyes while doing it. These were all on different occasions, by the way. Hey sir, someone left a whole bunch of brownies in the sky crawl. They weren't brownies. Cleaning throw up out of the sky tubes. The smell was horrifying. Thank you, unnamed Chuck E. Cheese employee who saved naive, desperate for employment me by answering my question about employment with, "You don't want to work here. You're a hero." Anytime a kid threw up in the ball pit was an especially horrible day. There were several instances during the 6 years I'd worked there, but these times were quite memorable. There were 2 ways you could do this. A large, both sides opened cardboard box to cordon off the affected area, and saying it was a slow day and other kids weren't splashing all the balls around, we'd then put all of the cordon balls into a large netting bag so that we could gather them, take them outside, and they'd be sprayed off. Or there was the second way of cleaning. If the mess was all over the ball pit, then all of the balls had to be gathered, sprayed off, and the inside liner that held the balls had to be wiped down and cleaned. The only good thing about having to take all of them out was that you could find some pretty good stuff that happened to be in people's pockets and fell out, including money, pocket knives, and even rings. I worked at Chuck E. Cheese as my first job. On more than one occasion, kids went up into the sky netting, which was basically a bird nest made out of rope suspended in the air, and then they'd just empty their bowels on the poor souls below. After this happened a few times, we decided to move the carousel ride, which had a roof, under the bird nest, so at least it would just land on the roof and not someone's head and/or dinner. Yep, a kid I was training was leading me to a skee-ball machine that he just couldn't fix. He was probably 5 feet in front of me and walked under the net. All of a sudden, white stuff just fell and covered his head. Some little kid had stuck his face through the netting and just emptied down on him. I was set to go home right then, and his shift had just started. My boss was going to make him stay since I was going home. I told him to go home and shower and I'd stay on till he got back. Surprisingly, he actually came back. Yeah, although I couldn't say I'd be surprised at him choosing to opt out, what I will say is that your compassion probably went a long way towards retaining him. We've probably all worked jobs that sucked but were made bearable by our co-workers, and it sounds like you were doing your part in making his time there marginally less awful, which is something. Former employee, I worked 6 months in high school. First one, a family racked up a $300 bill and tried to pay for it with food stamps, and the time 2 families got into a fight during their kid's birthday party and had to be escorted out by the police. I later found one of their weaves on the table. The third time, I got kicked in the crotch while in the Chuck E. Cheese suit. I'm a girl and it still hurt. Another little girl asked me when the real Chuck was going to come out because I was too short to be the real Chucky. And finally, a mum wanted to show her kid that under the costume I was just a real person and asked if I'd take off Chucky's head to show her daughter. I did, and the kid got even more freaked out, thinking that the mouse had engulfed me. I've repressed a lot of the memories, but this is the ones I can remember. I worked at Charles Entertainment Cheese for nearly 2 years during high school and then again later for 1 more year. The worst parts always had to do with the parents, of course. The one that sticks out in my head is the most super drunk, very unattractive older woman who had just not quit hitting on me and then got way too handsy. It was just after I started. I spent the first few months there working the game room floor. This lady came up to me saying one of the machines was not giving out tickets and I needed to check it out for her. I sat down on the stool to open up the panel and check things out. During this time, she began rubbing my back, saying how cute I was and how much of a help I was being. It was about this time I realized she reeked of booze and was drunk. Next thing I knew, one of her hands was somewhere it shouldn't be, and she had found the prize she was after. I quickly sprang up from my seat, saying I had to get some tools from the back. I went and told the games manager what happened. I'm not really sure what happened after that, as I stayed in the back for a while. The next time I came back out, she was gone, thankfully. As a whole, I look back at my time working there with some fond memories. Our place was almost entirely staffed with high school or young college kids. Had a ton of great times there and the pizza kicked butt. But yeah, cleaning crap out of the sky tube sucks. Oh, and I just remembered the craziest thing that happened while I worked there. Next door to us was the DMV, and one day a lady parked in the fire lane in front of it to help her elderly passenger inside find a seat. Well, in the time it took her to do that, a tow truck swooped in to tow her. This happened fairly frequently in our parking lot, so my coworker Buddy and I got closer to the glass at the front of the store to watch the shenanigans. The tow truck backed up right to the car, lifted the front end, and started pulling away with it. As the tow truck passed our window, we realized there were kids in the back seat. My buddy and I ran out the front doors of the store and started chasing after the guy, screaming about the kids. We finally caught up to him in the back of the parking lot where he'd usually secure the car to the truck before taking it back to the lot and told him what he did. He just said, "Oh crap," dropped the car and took off. At this point, the mum of the kids had run to where we were at, understandably screaming about her babies. The cops were called, and since we knew which company the truck belonged to, the tow truck driver eventually showed back up. Not sure how much trouble the driver actually got in, but the cops were telling us that the law states that tow truck drivers must verify there are no passengers in the car before doing a snatch and grab. Adrenaline was definitely pumping with me and my coworkers for a while after that one. I have a good friend who used to work at Chuck E. Cheese. Him and his fellow co-workers conspired over the span of a few months to steal the various pieces of the suit. They'd claim that this part got ripped or some kid messed up this part and we had to throw it out, until they had a full suit. For what reason, you ask? Literally just to take turns showing up to parties in the full suit to make a bunch of drunk people super stoked. I remember when I worked at that absolute crap hole. I had to take out the coins from the machines and refill the tickets and clean them. The worst thing that happened wasn't the number 2 or throw up in the tubes above that the kids crawled in, but the time a kid apparently had to go boom boom, but didn't want to go to the bathroom because he'd lose all of his progress. So he just let it all out right where he was standing. I guess he was 3 tokens deep, so he committed to the game. Well, at one point, he lost and ran out of tokens. Guess what he does next? If you guessed walks away leaving a mound of crap on the floor like it wasn't his, you're wrong. He frickin' grabbed said matter and just smeared it all over the machine like he was frosting a cake. Full-on tantrums while trying to talk smack, then just wiped his hands on the carpet. By the way, if you're thinking that turds are biohazard territory, you'd be a dummy to think that minimum wage workers aren't constantly required by managers to clean it up. This is correct. Sincerely, all other hospitality and gas station workers on the planet Earth. Says a lot about how we treat the bottom rung of society when we have to do the same job as a guy in hazmat gear. I worked there for only 4 months in high school before I quit. Everyone was required to wear the mouse costume. Kids would literally beat you up to get your attention. It sucked, because I went to a Catholic high school where we wore uniform skirts. Every Monday morning I'd go to the school covered in bruises. That must have raised a lot of questions about your home life, and one too many trips to the counselor's office. The worst part was wearing that rat suit after this one guy was in it. He took it seriously and would get up on the prize tables and get the kids to chant, "Chucky, Chucky." I could frickin' hear it back in the kitchen over the noise and music. The guy was completely undressed in the suit, and he sweat a lot. I probably have hepatitis. Best part, though, was taking the leftover pizza dough into the back lot after closing and having a 1v1 deathmatch throwing softball-sized dough balls at each other's heads. Luckily, this one didn't happen to me, but somebody got shanked. We actually hired a bouncer on our busiest days because we attracted the trashiest people. There was also a ton of banging in the Chuck E. Cheese closet. This happened in the state of California, where servers still make minimum wage, not some $2.13 bullcrap. I was originally offered around $8.50, but that was retracted and I was paid $8 because I'd received tips, supposedly, which is what motivated me to beat the system. I worked at a Chuck E. Cheese in high school in a wealthy area, so I got the bright idea to neatly fold and rip the part of the bill that stated tips are included in the cost. Because they weren't. I got my co-workers in on it, and eventually we started presenting the bills to each other's parties and saying, if you'd like to tip your host, they can only accept cash, to plant the idea in the parents' head. One day, we got caught. I got blamed. I wasn't allowed to host parties anymore. Instead, the general manager hired his family and friends and allowed them to take advantage of my system. It was a goldmine, because sometimes I'd take home $200 in cash as a 16-year-old. I didn't even make that in 2 weekends of hourly pay. Not my story, but my dad's. This was decades ago. He worked as the man in the suit and all of his friends knew it. He had this one friend, we can call him Gene, who liked to take things over the top. He was working, and suddenly my dad hears a roar. He turns to see his buddy Gene sprinting at him full speed, no stop in sight. Boom! My dad is on the ground, head off, and the only thing heard was the screams of young children. My dad got fired that day. He told me that his boss thought it was a planned prank on the company. As much as my dad denied it, he couldn't keep himself from laughing. My dad was a known prankster anyways, so he just accepted it. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below. And if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. Former manager checking in from like 10 to 15 years ago. I have a few worsts, I'll divide them up below. The actual worst? The time a custody dispute carried into a birthday party for a 3-year-old. Multiple people had gats and knives, someone actually fired at the mother, and someone else tried to cut the father. This caused a full-on riot resulting in a lockdown. Luckily, we were very close to a police station and no one was seriously injured. The hilarious worst was 2 employees doing the deed in the Chuck E. closet, where employees could go change without being in the way of the kitchen or in sight of the children. The clincher was that one was wearing the Chuck E. Cheese head. This was bad because once the closet was unlocked and open, you were in sight, and we had lots of horrified parents and terrified children, and it was really hard not to laugh. The creepy worst was one of the animatronics failing and becoming possessed. We were about 2 weeks away from becoming a Stage 2 store, which was the next level of upgrades and improvements, including removing the animatronics. So they just told us to let it go and try to keep it in check. It sounded demonic and would just turn on at random. Like in the middle of the Happy Birthday song, its head caught a point that it couldn't turn anymore and got stuck moving a few inches back and forth and then caught on fire while trying to demonically still sing. And the sad worst. We all had to get background checks if we had not been employed for 30 days because of a manager in our district, but not from our store, who turned out to not be taking care of his dying mother for a month. He was actually in jail for a DUI. The area manager was concerned about what else they didn't know because he'd been with the company for like 25 years and worked up from a cashier. They ran a background check and he had multiple issues with the law. His family vacations were all timed with when he was in jail, and he was a registered unspeakable act offender. Not the worst, actually pretty good depending on your perspective. My dad used to manage one back in the mid-80s and would always go through the cash registers at the end of every night and trade in his own pocket change for all of the rare, vintage coinage that teenagers would steal from their parents' stashes. He amassed a great collection of silver coins and other discontinued currency. Mercury dimes, buffalo nickels, stuff like that. He still has all of it to this day. I was the technician at a Chuck E. Cheese in high school. One day I was covering someone and I had to wear the suit and do the show. On my way back to the room, a little kid ran up to see Chucky and stabbed me in the ankle with a pencil as hard as he could. I rushed into the back room and took off the pants portion of the suit, pulled down my sock and a bunch of blood poured out. Didn't even go home early, the boss just had me stand at the door. Charles Entertainment Cheese. You can lie down and dress your injuries when you're dead. Seriously, as crap as most minimum wage hospo jobs are, this particular chain does sound like it might be the worst one to work for. Like, I worked at McDonald's and this blows it out of the water. Am I wrong? Any positive experiences working with the rat in the comments? Former employee of 9 months. There was once a very old woman peeing on the carpet in the entrance while standing up. Also cleaning pee out of the sky tubes after a complaint that it got in a kid's eyes and he couldn't see. Then there was walking into the bathroom to find an abandoned pair of undies with number 2 still in it. Took everything I had not to throw up while throwing it away. Also, while in the Chucky suit, being asked by a large black woman wearing all blue, "Why you got all that red on you?" And finally, asking a mute girl if she wanted to put candles on her cake and being told she can't talk by her parents. There were definitely many more less than enjoyable experiences, but these are the ones that stand out to me. So, to sum all these stories up, ball pits are nasty and you should watch out for crap and throw up in the high tubes. Not an employee, but one time as a very young kid, my older brother almost got lured out of the building by a stranger with the promise of a bunch of free tickets. I intervened and everything was fine, the employees were notified. Another time, the same kid almost got into a truck to help find a missing puppy. He was a very kidnappable kid, I guess, but I can't seem to get rid of his dumb idiot butt. Once I walked in on this 40-year-old man just giving his pickle a little tickle. Our eyes met and we kinda just stared at one another. Most awkward 10 seconds of my life. That damn suit. I was a game room technician. That part was awesome. I got to play games all day, fix coin jams. However, one day, before I was allowed to leave, they decided I had to wear the suit. This was 10 years ago, so it was before the redesign of Chuck E. Cheese. I'm 6 foot, and with the suits on, ears included, I was a giant. You can't really see in the damned thing. Anyways, they led me out into the main hall, and I was basically lumbering around. It's this horrible experience because I couldn't see. I kept bumping into things. You'd think this would be the worst part, but nope. It was the kids I scared. They counted. I made 7 children break down, scream, and bawl their eyes out. I felt like crap for it. Wasn't much that I could do, though. It got better. I finally got to take the suit off and left. I was walking to my car and this family was leaving. Their little boy was crying. I figured it was due to having to leave. Nope. He was just wailing because Chuck E. Cheese terrified him. The mum goes, "I've had it. You need to straighten up already. If you don't, I'll take you back in and feed you to that giant mouse." Worst experience. Another time we had these sketchy guys come in and try to rob us right before close. Our manager, let's call him O, decided he wasn't going to call the cops and he'd handle it himself. So he runs back to the kitchen, grabs a pizza cutter, which is basically a giant curved machete. He was trying to be all sneaky and kind of hide it by keeping it close to his leg. We all thought we were about to get shot because he wanted to play hero. The guys ended up fleeing, after seeing him with a giant blade, but it was a pretty terrifying experience for a young high school kid. Having to wear that costume, it's probably one of the most degrading things I've ever had to do. Having to clean the bathrooms, watching children open up the containers with cheese and lick them, and wondering how many times I've used condiments after children have licked them, catching strep throat several times, having a group of bored parents test the system of making sure the correct kid leaves with the correct parent. We don't usually check this because it would be obvious if you're taking the kid because the kid would be crying. That would usually be when I'd check if the kid didn't look like the parent. Or having some lady accuse us of spraying Windex in the salad. Our manager told us we couldn't take sick days unless we had a doctor's note, which is against the law. Managers would scream and degrade us teenagers in front of whoever. Having to close at the end of the night because we'd basically be cleaning up after children. But yeah, having to deal with crappy parents. Having parents complain about our attitude because we don't want to be around their crappy kids, having kids constantly running while you're trying to deliver a pizza, wheelies, having to clean the sky tubes after a kid unloaded in them, having to work with teenagers who are not the nicest groups of people, mothers dropping their children's diapers on the floor instead of the trash can, I've blocked the rest out. One time at Charles Entertainment Cheese when I was working there, some food fight broke out and one kid chucked his entire cake straight at Chucky, and then he cried out about how he didn't get a cake. The kid's mum went to the bathroom and she was in there for a good 15 minutes. I went in there to ask what was up and I saw her having a mental breakdown. Turns out she spent hours making that cake specially for him, and it was all ruined in about 30 seconds. You know what? After hearing all these, I'm going to be telling my son that he's lucky as crap that he got hired on at Domino's before Chuck E. Cheese got back to him. One time I saw two families going at it, throwing punches, cursing, and spitting because one of the kids took some tickets from one of the arcade games that didn't belong to him. Cops had to be called and both dads got arrested. Okay, this is wild. This is easily the third story I've heard about an all-out brawl happening at this chain. One of them I think I'd heard before I'd made this video. These places are more of a hotbed for human trash than cruise ships. That's right, you heard me. I've been at Chuck E. Cheese for 4 years. I'm a cashier and I remember I had a closing shift one night. Cashiers close down the cash area, salad bar, beverage bar, and restrooms, at least at my location. I usually leave the restrooms last, so on that night I'd finished up everything else and went to clean the restrooms. My locations are typically very clean, so I never had an issue with these, until that day. When I walked into the ladies' room, I saw what no employee wants to see in the restrooms. It was in the biggest stall, just imagine turds, but everywhere. On the walls, on the seat, on the floor, it was like semi-solid, almost liquid-like. On the floor near the drain was more. Imagine the emoji, but in real life. That's what was there. I remember a coworker came in and Snapchatted it for some reason. I have no idea how a human could have accomplished that. I called in my manager for backup. He came in and screamed. I screamed. Then we cleaned it up begrudgingly. I wore like 5 pairs of gloves at the same time. It took us far longer than usual. I wasn't happy to say the least. Luckily, it's never happened since. Nothing has ever been worse than that. In short, the big stall of the women's restroom, explosion of liquid-like crap everywhere. The real-life equivalent of the poopy emoji also makes an appearance. My manager and I scream in horror. This happened 15 years or so ago. I was designated to be the big cheese himself, a glorious honor. And the fact that I was one of the only guys that worked there meant that I was always the one chosen for that hot suit. This day, a football team was having a party there, 10 or 12-year-olds or something. My manager knew what was going to happen to me, though. My young, naive brain only had innocent thoughts about making the children happy. Then the coach playfully tosses me a football. At least it was in my limited field of vision, so I actually caught it. And it happened. A horde of 10-year-olds descended upon me in the cramped area between 2 long tables. Valiantly as I tried to keep my balance, these little demons proceeded to tackle me onto the ground. I thankfully didn't break anything and I kept my head from falling off while being knocked around, but I was angry. As soon as they got off me, I got up and left to go into the back and take off the Charles Entertainment Cheese outfit. Another time, the same manager as the last story made me work off the clock, but I was too young and dumb to document and report it. When you subscribe, make sure to hit the bell to turn on notifications. Put the playlist on in the background to finish listening to all the stories, or if you want some vibey music to put on in the background, check out easymode. If you like Am I the Genius, give Am I the Jerk a shot. Everything linked in the description.